In the shadows of boardrooms and backrooms, one man pulled the strings of America's power. Judges, senators, movie moguls, all bent to a quiet voice from Chicago. This is the story of the fixer who built an empire of crime and corruption in plain sight. The story begins in a place most Americans have never heard of, yet its shadows stretch across the 20th century like the reach of an invisible empire. This isn't just a tale of mobsters and politicians, of backroom deals and silent handshakes. It's the story of how America itself was shaped, often invisibly, by a hidden network of lawyers, businessmen, and fixers who operated in the space between legitimacy and crime. At the very center of the story is one man, Sidney Korshak, a lawyer from Chicago who never argued a case in court, but became one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood, Las Vegas, and Wall Street. Sidney Korshak was not a household name. To the average American, he was a phantom. Yet to presidents, governors, CEOs, and mob bosses, he was indispensable. He was the fixer, a man who could move millions of dollars, silence labor disputes, and arrange favors with a phone call made quietly from his table at the bistro in Beverly Hills. To understand how a lawyer from Chicago's West Side rose to such quiet supremacy, we need to go back before his birth, to the forces that shaped his family and the world he inherited. The Korshak story begins not in Chicago but in the Pale of Settlement, that stretch of Eastern Europe where millions of Jews lived under harsh restrictions in the Russian Empire. In Kiev, Odessa, and countless small towns, Jewish families faced heavy taxes, social exclusion, and waves of violent pogroms. For the Korshaks, as for so many others, the future was bleak. The pogroms of the 1880s destroyed lives, shattered homes, and left scars that carried forward across generations. Survival demanded escape, and escape meant America. By the late 19th century, the Korshak family, like thousands of others, boarded steamships bound for Ellis Island, then moved inland to the booming city of Chicago. They settled first in Maxwell Street, the teeming immigrant district, before moving west into Lawndale, where opportunity, though still scarce, was at least imaginable. This neighborhood became a crucible for ambition, toughness, and a relentless drive for success. Life in Maxwell Street was harsh. Crowded tenements, street markets alive with Yiddish, and constant proximity to crime created a place that was both vibrant and dangerous. It was here that toughness became second nature. Bloody Maxwell, as newspapers called it, produced both celebrated musicians and hardened criminals, both business visionaries and mob enforcers. For families like the Korshaks, education and hard work were the ticket out. But even as children studied, they absorbed another lesson. Survival required connections, and power often came from bending the rules. By the time Sidney was born in 1907, the family had settled into Lawndale. This was the second settlement for Chicago's Russian Jews, a step up from the chaos of Maxwell Street. Lawndale had parks, boulevards, and synagogues, but it also had political machines and shadow economies that offered their own ladders of opportunity. Young Sidney grew up in a house where toughness and ambition were expected. His father, Harry, worked as a contractor. His brother Marshall would become a polished politician. But Sidney, quieter and more calculating, was drawn to the world of law, not to stand in court, but to stand behind the men who pulled the strings. At Marshall High School, Sidney excelled academically and athletically, a star basketball player with a reputation for toughness. At the University of Wisconsin and later DePaul Law School, he built a foundation that was less about legal theory and more about practical advantage. The law for Sidney was not about justice. It was about leverage. And in Chicago, leverage meant relationships with politicians, with union bosses, and increasingly with the mob. Chicago in the 1920s and 30s was the perfect training ground. Prohibition had made the city a capital of organized crime, with Al Capone and his outfit dominating headlines. But behind the scenes, another class of operator was emerging. The lawyers, accountants, and fixers who could translate mob money into legitimate business. These men didn't shoot rivals in alleys. They drew up contracts, brokered deals, and ensured that the outfit's interests were protected in boardrooms as well as backrooms. Sidney Korshak slid naturally into this role. He associated with Jake Arvey, the powerful political boss of Chicago's 24th Ward, and learned how patronage could turn votes into power and power into money. He observed how labor racketeering gave the outfit control over industries from trucking to construction, and he discovered his own unique gift: the ability to operate in shadows, to connect men who could never be seen together, and to make problems disappear without leaving fingerprints. It was in these years that Sidney first connected with the Chicago outfit, particularly with figures like Tony Joe Batters Accardo and Murray Curly Humphreys. These men respected Sidney not because he carried a gun, but because he carried something more valuable: access. He could talk to judges, politicians, and businessmen in ways that gangsters could not. He became the bridge between the underworld and the legitimate world, a role that would define him for the rest of his life. The 1930s depression only deepened the need for such operators. With industries collapsing, unions fighting for survival, and the outfit moving deeper into gambling and racketeering, Chicago was a city of opportunity for men who could manage both law and crime. Korshak began representing unions, sometimes sincerely, often as a front for mob control. He learned the mechanics of strikes, negotiations, and settlements, and he learned how to use them as weapons. A threatened strike could ruin a studio, a casino, or a hotel. A strike averted could make millions. Sidney knew how to pull those levers. But his genius wasn't just tactical. It was atmospheric. He cultivated an aura of mystery. He was impeccably dressed, always controlled, and rarely quoted. He avoided the spotlight, preferring to let others speak his name in whispers. FBI agents would later say that Korshak never raised his voice, never left a paper trail, and never betrayed emotion. He was, in effect, the lawyer as myth. As the years moved forward, Korshak's orbit expanded beyond Chicago. He became involved with Hollywood labor disputes, where mob influence over unions like the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees gave the outfit leverage over the film industry. He became entangled in Las Vegas, where Teamsters pension funds financed casinos and skim operations thrived. And he became a fixture in Beverly Hills, where his table at the bistro became a kind of shadow boardroom for America's entertainment and business elite. But that's where our story is heading. For now, in these early years, Sidney Korshak was still becoming the man who would one day be called the most powerful lawyer in the world who never practiced law. His roots in Lawndale, his education in Chicago politics, his apprenticeship under ward bosses and outfit figures, these were the building blocks of the empire of influence he would soon command. This is where the story of the Supermob begins. Not with the gunfire of Capone's Chicago, but with the quiet, calculated rise of a young lawyer from Lawndale, learning how to turn law into power and power into untouchable influence. Sidney Korshak's rise cannot be separated from the broader world of Chicago in the 1930s, a city where politics, crime, and business were inseparable. Every ward had its boss, every union its fixer, every corporation its friends in City Hall. The Great Depression deepened these alliances because survival demanded influence. Factories were closing, workers were desperate, and politicians were scrambling for both votes and cash. Into this fragile ecosystem stepped men like Jake Arvey, the ward kingmaker who could deliver entire precincts on election day. Sidney studied under him like an apprentice under a master craftsman. Arvey showed Sidney that power wasn't always about brute force, it was about obligation. You helped a man get a job, you paid his rent when times were bad, and you expected his loyalty in return. You secured a contract for a businessman, and you could call in the favor years later when you needed campaign funds or a discreet donation. Politics was a ledger of debts, and Sidney grasped the system intuitively. At the same time, Korshak understood something the older bosses didn't. The law was an instrument as powerful as any ballot box or pistol. The courtroom could legitimize what muscle alone could not. If a gangster needed protection, Sidney could make a phone call and line up a judge sympathetic to the cause. If a business magnate wanted labor peace, Sidney could lean on the unions and make the problem vanish. He had become a translator, speaking both the rough dialect of the streets and the polished language of boardrooms. It was during these years that Korshak began attracting the attention of the Chicago outfit, the syndicate that had succeeded Capone after the bootlegging wars. The outfit understood that the future of organized crime wasn't just gambling halls and speakeasies. It was control over unions, construction contracts, and financial institutions. Tony Accardo, the soft-spoken but iron-fisted successor to Capone, saw in Korshak a tool more valuable than any enforcer. Accardo and his lieutenants realized that Sidney could walk into places they could not. He could sit across from mayors, senators, and studio heads without raising alarms. He could negotiate on behalf of mob interests without ever looking like he was doing so. And because Sidney never boasted, never sought headlines, and never left a trail, he became almost untouchable. By the late 1930s, Sidney was handling matters for outfit-linked unions, smoothing out labor disputes that might otherwise have paralyzed industries. Railroads, garment factories, trucking companies, wherever labor could be leveraged, Sidney was there to mediate. But everyone in the room knew mediation was just a polite word. It meant that if you wanted peace, you paid. If you wanted trouble, you resisted. Sidney made sure almost nobody resisted. As the Second World War loomed, Chicago was already evolving into a hub of war production. Factories that once churned out consumer goods shifted to armaments and machinery. With this transformation came a surge in labor disputes, strikes, and demands for better conditions. Officially, Sidney Korshak was a labor lawyer helping to resolve these tensions. Unofficially, he was ensuring that outfit-controlled unions got their cut and that companies who played ball could keep their assembly lines humming. It was in this era that Korshak honed one of his defining techniques, the invisible negotiation. He rarely appeared in public as the face of a settlement. Instead, he would whisper in the ear of a union boss, then call the company's lawyer, then check in with a political contact downtown. Days later, the strike would quietly evaporate. Workers would return, contracts would be signed, and both sides would shake hands, not entirely sure what had just happened, only that it had happened through Sid. This quiet effectiveness made him indispensable. Unlike brash mobsters who flaunted wealth or politicians who courted headlines, Sidney cultivated opacity. To outsiders, he seemed almost bland. A quiet lawyer in a tailored suit, always courteous, rarely photographed. But to insiders, he was becoming a legend. Some began calling him the Duke. Others, more colorfully, called him the Myth. The Myth because even in his presence, he felt half invisible, a man who could erase his own fingerprints from every deal. At the same time, Sidney's personal life reflected his dual existence. He lived well but not ostentatiously, preferring discretion over flamboyance. He surrounded himself with beautiful women, yes, but always in a way that seemed to confirm his mystique rather than diminish it. He was never sloppy, never careless. The underworld admired him because he never cracked under pressure. The upper world admired him because he seemed above the dirt, even when he was knee-deep in it. Meanwhile, the Korshak name itself was branching out in different directions. His brother Marshall embraced the more traditional route of politics, becoming a respected Chicago politician with a reputation for competence and loyalty to the Democratic machine. Marshall represented the family's public face, while Sidney operated in shadows. This division of roles made the Korshak name both respectable and formidable. One brother shaking hands at community events, the other pulling unseen levers behind the curtain. By the early 1940s, Sidney was poised for the leap that would define his career, the move westward. Hollywood was entering its golden age, but beneath the glamour of movie stars and studio lots, it was a cauldron of labor unrest. Stagehands, projectionists, set builders, all were unionized, and all were vulnerable to mob influence. The studios, terrified of strikes that could halt multi-million-dollar productions, needed someone who could guarantee peace. And the outfit, sensing new territory to control, needed someone who could make introductions without spooking executives. Sidney Korshak was that man. Hollywood was about to discover what Chicago already knew. Sidney didn't need to fire a shot or sign a contract to control an empire. He only needed to sit quietly at a table, lean slightly forward, and speak in that calm, measured tone that promised peace or promised chaos, depending on whether you listened. And so, from the crowded streets of Maxwell and the political machine of Lawndale, Sidney Korshak's journey carried him toward the palm-lined boulevards of Los Angeles, where the real stage of the Supermob would be set. The networks forged in Chicago, the union ties, the mob alliances, the political connections were now ready to be exported. And in California, Sidney would find a stage big enough to match his talent for invisibility. The story of the Supermob and Sidney's central role in it was just beginning to unfold. What started in pogrom-haunted villages and the crowded markets of Maxwell Street was about to shape Hollywood studios, Las Vegas casinos, and even the White House itself. For Sidney Korshak, the boy from Lawndale, the path was clear. The law was not a profession. It was a weapon, and in his hands it would make him untouchable. By the time the 1940s arrived, Sidney Korshak had outgrown Chicago. The city had been his proving ground, the place where he learned how to wield law like a scalpel and loyalty like a shield. But the real money, the real stage, was on the West Coast. Hollywood was booming. Motion pictures were no longer a novelty. They were America's dominant art form, a cultural force shaping how the nation dreamed. With box office numbers climbing and millions of Americans flocking to theaters every week, studios became as powerful as governments. And wherever there was power, Sidney knew there would also be pressure points. Labor unions were the soft underbelly of Hollywood. Projectionists, carpenters, set decorators, makeup artists, camera operators, they were all unionized. A strike in one department could paralyze an entire production. A strike across multiple unions could bring an entire studio system to its knees. The men who controlled those unions controlled Hollywood itself. Enter the outfit. Chicago's mob had already mastered the business of labor racketeering back home, using unions as both shields and weapons. Now they saw the West Coast as ripe for the same kind of leverage. But there was a problem. Hollywood executives would never sit down with mobsters in silk shirts and fedoras. They needed someone who could straddle both worlds, someone who could speak the language of contracts and arbitration while carrying the unspoken weight of the outfit's muscle. That someone was Sidney Korshak. Sidney's arrival in Los Angeles was subtle, almost deliberately low-key. He didn't make headlines. He didn't throw parties. Instead, he set up shop quietly, moving between Beverly Hills hotels and discreet office spaces. He cultivated relationships not with the stars who were too visible, but with the men who actually ran Hollywood. Studio chiefs, talent agents, labor leaders. He didn't need to charm them with wit or charisma. He offered something far more valuable: labor peace. The story would repeat itself over and over again. A strike would threaten to shut down production on a major film. Studio heads would panic. Millions were at stake. Phone calls would be made, contacts whispered, and then Sidney would appear, calm, courteous, impeccably dressed. He would listen, nod, perhaps make a few calls from a private line. And within days, sometimes within hours, the strike would evaporate. Workers returned, executives breathed easier, and production rolled on. Everyone knew what had happened, though few dared to say it aloud. The message was clear. If you wanted to avoid chaos, you went through Sid. If you wanted your movies made on time and on budget, you treated him with respect. He was not officially on anyone's payroll, yet every studio in town understood that his presence was insurance money well spent. Hollywood had always been vulnerable to strongmen. In the 1920s, studios had hired gangsters to guard film shipments and to muscle in on independent producers. But the post-war period brought a new sophistication. Instead of hired thugs with bats, you had men like Korshak, lawyers with smooth manners and Rolodexes full of senators, governors, and union chiefs. He didn't need to threaten anyone directly. The mere suggestion that he represented interests larger than himself was enough. To the mob, Hollywood wasn't just about money, though there was plenty of that. It was about legitimacy. Movies created culture. They influenced fashion, politics, even morality. If the outfit could sink its hooks into that industry, it wouldn't just skim profits from labor disputes. It would place itself inside the very machinery of American imagination. And Sidney Korshak was the man holding the keys. Sidney also understood the importance of geography. He chose his battlegrounds carefully. The Bistro, a stylish restaurant on Cannon Drive in Beverly Hills, became his unofficial headquarters. It looked like any other upscale eatery, but to insiders it was something else entirely. A power table in plain sight. 2 phones were installed at his preferred table, and from there he conducted business that spanned from Chicago to Las Vegas to Wall Street. Studio bosses, politicians, and even underworld figures came and went, all under the guise of a casual lunch. Reporters sometimes spotted him but could rarely get a quote. Sid cultivated silence as much as he cultivated influence. He understood that mystery was power. If people couldn't quite pin down what he did, they would assume he could do anything. That assumption, multiplied across industries, gave him leverage no court order could ever grant. Meanwhile, Los Angeles itself was changing. The city was exploding with growth. Defense contracts from World War II had poured billions into Southern California, fueling aerospace companies, shipping firms, and infrastructure projects. With the war over, the city turned its energy back to entertainment, real estate, and leisure. Hotels rose, freeways cut across the landscape, and suburban sprawl stretched outward toward the desert. Every one of these ventures required labor, construction, and financing, the very areas where the outfit and the supermob excelled. Sidney positioned himself at the nexus. He wasn't just smoothing out movie strikes. He was advising developers, brokering introductions between investors, and aligning labor deals to suit both mob interests and corporate needs. He became the quiet broker of Southern California's growth, the shadow counselor whose approval could make or break multimillion-dollar projects. And yet, for all his growing influence, his name rarely appeared in print. Even the FBI, which tracked him obsessively, complained in internal memos that he was impenetrable. He left no paper trail, no official records, no smoking gun. He operated in conversations, handshakes, and favors owed. He was becoming the archetype of a new breed of power broker, invisible, deniable, but absolutely essential. But Sidney was not alone. Around him coalesced a network of similarly positioned men, lawyers, financiers, businessmen, many of whom shared his background in Chicago's Jewish immigrant community. They had grown up in the same neighborhoods, gone to the same schools, learned the same lessons about survival and ambition. Together, they formed what would later be called the Supermob. The term captured their unique role. They were not street gangsters. They were not merely politicians or businessmen. They were the architects behind the curtain, channeling mob money into real estate, corporations, and legitimate enterprises. They gave the outfit and its allies something priceless: respectability. And in return, they received access to capital and protection that allowed them to amass fortunes. Sidney Korshak, with his calm demeanor and legendary discretion, was the Supermob's lawyer-in-chief, its most visible, invisible man. Hollywood in the 1940s was glamorous on the surface, but beneath the lights and red carpets it was brittle, fragile, and combustible. Behind every premiere and every glittering star was a studio system constantly terrified of collapse. The system relied on stability, steady filming schedules, completed movies, constant box office revenue. And nothing threatened that stability more than a labor strike. The unions in Hollywood were powerful and restless. The International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, known as IATSE, could shut down entire productions if negotiations soured. The Screen Actors Guild was gaining strength, as was the American Federation of Musicians, which could cripple a studio's ability to score its films. Each union had legitimate grievances: low wages, unsafe conditions, long hours, but they also had something else: the interest of organized crime. Gangsters had already learned that controlling unions in Chicago and New York meant controlling entire industries. Now, in Los Angeles, they saw a chance to control the dream factory itself. But instead of barging in with brass knuckles and baseball bats, they slipped in with lawyers, fixers, and consultants. At the center of this strategy was Sidney Korshak. Sidney never needed to raise his voice. When executives saw him walk into a room, they knew the conversation had already been decided elsewhere. If a strike needed to be settled, Sid would make the calls. If a union leader needed to be reminded where his loyalties lay, Sid would arrange the reminder. If a studio boss wanted to be sure the next blockbuster wasn't derailed, Sid's quiet assurance was enough. For the mob, this was revolutionary. They didn't need to own the studios. They just needed to own the conditions under which studios operated. By leveraging the threat of labor unrest, they positioned themselves as indispensable middlemen. And Sidney Korshak, calm and unassuming, became their perfect face. Executives liked him because he seemed reasonable. Union bosses respected him because he delivered results. And mobsters trusted him because he never betrayed them. In an industry built on illusion, Sid was the most effective illusionist of them all. He made chaos disappear without anyone ever seeing the trick. One of the first major battles that cemented his reputation was the post-war studio strikes of the mid-1940s. Disputes erupted over wages, overtime, and working conditions for thousands of set decorators, carpenters, and craftsmen. Pickets lined studio gates. Police clashed with strikers. Hollywood was on the verge of paralysis. Sidney was not publicly named in the negotiations, but those inside knew his hand was guiding the process. He spoke with union leaders, many of whom were already compromised by outfit connections. He spoke with studio lawyers, promising outcomes that seemed impossible hours earlier. And slowly, methodically, the fires cooled. Productions resumed. The crisis passed. The strikes were remembered as one of the most dangerous moments in Hollywood labor history. But to insiders, they also confirmed something else. Nothing happened without Korshak. He wasn't a union leader and he wasn't a studio executive. He was something rarer, a man who could command both. Hollywood wasn't his only frontier. As the 1950s approached, Las Vegas was rising from the desert, shimmering with neon and ambition. The city was still rough around the edges. Dusty streets, smoky casinos, quick fortunes won and lost. But everyone could see what it was becoming. A playground for America, fueled by money from every corner of the country. The outfit had been there from the beginning, bankrolling hotels and skimming profits from casino floors. But casinos needed legitimacy. They needed labor peace, corporate financing, and political cover. Once again, Sidney Korshak fit the bill perfectly. Through his connections to the Teamsters Union and its powerful pension fund, Sid helped channel hundreds of millions of dollars into Vegas construction projects. Hotels like the Riviera and the Stardust rose not just from desert sand but from the invisible scaffolding of mob-backed loans. The Teamsters provided the money, the outfit controlled the operations, and Sidney kept everyone at the table. When disputes arose over wages or contracts, Sid was there. When politicians questioned where the money came from, Sid smoothed it over. When executives worried about bad publicity, Sid assured them the story would never reach the papers. Las Vegas glowed with neon, but behind the lights was a lawyer from Lawndale, pulling strings in silence. This dual command of Hollywood and Las Vegas made Sidney Korshak one of the most powerful figures in America, though most Americans had never heard his name. He was the bridge between fantasy and fortune, between the movie screens that captivated audiences and the casino floors that swallowed their paychecks. He was not elected, not appointed, and not even officially employed by the corporations he influenced. Yet his word carried more weight than contracts or court orders. Around him, the supermob was taking shape. Men like Paul Zifrin, Jake Arvey, and Alex Greenberg were investing in California real estate, turning farmland into suburbs and deserts into resorts. Financiers like the Pritzkers and Henry Crown built empires with the quiet backing of outfit-friendly loans. Judges, senators, and even presidents benefited from their campaign contributions. The supermob wasn't a formal organization with meetings and bylaws. It was a network, a brotherhood bound by shared origins, shared risks, and shared rewards. Sidney was its fixer-in-chief, the man who could navigate every layer, from gangsters in smoky backrooms to moguls in Beverly Hills mansions. The FBI knew he was at the center of it. Their files on Korshak grew thicker every year. Agents noted his associations, tracked his movements, compiled endless reports. Yet they never seemed able to catch him. He was always a step removed, always shielded by layers of plausible deniability. When questioned, executives swore he was just a lawyer offering advice. Union leaders shrugged and said he was a friend. Politicians insisted he was a supporter of labor peace. And so, the man who never tried a case in open court was shaping the destinies of entire industries. The myth lived up to his name. By the end of the 1950s, Sidney Korshak had become the essential shadow broker of American capitalism. From the sound stages of Hollywood to the casinos of Las Vegas, from corporate boardrooms to union halls, his influence was everywhere and his presence was nowhere. The Supermob, once a loose collection of Chicago boys looking for opportunity, had grown into a force that touched every American life. Through the movies they watched, the hotels they visited, the pensions they trusted, and the politicians they voted for. And yet, to the public, it was invisible. The newspapers covered movie stars, not labor lawyers. The magazines profiled casino showgirls, not mob fixers. The name Sidney Korshak appeared rarely, if at all. But in every whispered conversation, in every closed-door deal, in every crisis averted, his shadow stretched long. Hollywood had learned to live by his rules. Las Vegas thrived under his guidance. And America itself was beginning to feel the reach of a man who believed in one principle above all. Power is safest when it cannot be seen. By the dawn of the 1960s, Sidney Korshak was no longer just a lawyer from Chicago or even a Hollywood labor fixer. He had become something far more elusive, a man who could tilt the balance of entire industries with nothing more than a phone call. To the outside world, the 60s were an age of glamour and change. John F. Kennedy's charisma promised a new American era. Rock and roll was exploding, the civil rights movement was marching, and Hollywood basked in its golden glow. Yet behind the glitter, another current ran quietly, almost invisibly. It was the current of power, and in that current, Sidney Korshak was the undertow. Hollywood's moguls now knew better than to cross him. Studio bosses had watched enough strikes evaporate under his guidance to understand what he represented. Korshak wasn't just a lawyer mediating disputes. He was the invisible fulcrum on which labor peace balanced. The most powerful entertainment company of them all, MCA, the Music Corporation of America, exemplified this. Founded by Jules Stein and expanded by Lew Wasserman, MCA had become a giant, controlling talent, films, and eventually even television. Its rise was meteoric, but it was also fraught with labor dangers. The unions could have crippled MCA at any moment. That didn't happen because MCA had Sidney Korshak. He wasn't listed on their masthead. He wasn't on their payroll, but he was in their corner, smoothing negotiations, silencing dissent, ensuring that the company's growth was never disrupted by strikes. When questions arose about how MCA managed to escape the fate of other studios crushed by labor battles, insiders would whisper one name: Sid. Sid's discretion made him invaluable. He never needed to raise his profile, and in fact he preferred not to. Executives could point to their contracts, unions could point to their agreements, and mobsters could point to their profits, but none had to point to him. He was the constant presence that no one mentioned. This secrecy suited Korshak perfectly. He had long ago understood that the less his name appeared in public, the more powerful he became in private. He cultivated silence as carefully as other men cultivated wealth. In Beverly Hills, he was seen often at the bistro, his unofficial headquarters, but he was never quoted, never interviewed, never pinned down. He became an enigma, which made him irresistible to the powerful. While Hollywood made Sid indispensable, Las Vegas made him rich. The desert city was exploding in the 1960s, transforming from a dusty gambling town into a neon empire. Hotels like the Sands, the Stardust, and the Riviera rose into the desert sky, each financed by hidden streams of mob-backed cash. The outfit had perfected the skim, siphoning untaxed profits from casino floors, and the Teamsters pension fund, worth hundreds of millions, became their private bank. Jimmy Hoffa, the tough, swaggering leader of the Teamsters, was officially in charge of those pension funds. But when it came to actually moving the money, deciding which projects lived and which died, Hoffa had to reckon with Sidney Korshak. Sid's word was final, because Sid answered to men Hoffa could never afford to cross. It was a strange triangle of power. Hoffa commanded the pension funds, the outfit commanded Hoffa, and Sid commanded the silence that made it all possible. Without him, deals fell apart. With him, casinos bloomed. Vegas was also where Hollywood and the mob collided most visibly. Stars like Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. filled the casino showrooms, drawing crowds and legitimizing the mob's desert empire. The Rat Pack, as they were known, became cultural icons, But behind the scenes their performances were often bankrolled and arranged by men like Korshak. Frank Sinatra, in particular, relied heavily on Sid's counsel. Sinatra's friendships with mobsters were no secret, and they often jeopardized his career. When federal investigators circled or studio contracts wavered, it was Sid who smoothed the waters. He was Sinatra's silent protector, ensuring that the singer's fame remained untarnished even when the company he kept drew unwanted attention. In return, Sinatra offered more than loyalty. He became a bridge between the underworld, Hollywood, and even politics. Sinatra's friendships with the Kennedys, for instance, gave Korshak indirect access to the White House. For a man who never sought public office, Sid wielded influence in Washington nonetheless. The 60s were also a time when politics itself began bending toward the supermob. Chicago, always the beating heart of the Democratic machine, sent its influence westward through figures like Jake Arvey and Paul Zifrin. Campaigns needed money, unions delivered votes, and men like Sid made sure both flowed smoothly. When John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, Chicago's political machine, and by extension, the network Sid had mastered, played a decisive role. The narrow victory in Illinois was attributed by many to the Cook County Democratic machine, whose operators knew better than anyone how to count votes. Sid himself never appeared in campaign photographs or headlines, but his network was humming just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the FBI was watching. J. Edgar Hoover's men tracked Korshak obsessively. They tailed him to the bistro, noted his companions, tapped phones where they could. Yet time and again they hit a wall. Sid left no paper trail. He was careful never to incriminate himself. Agents wrote reports calling him the key link between organized crime and legitimate business, but those reports gathered dust. No indictment ever stuck. Part of the problem was Sid's own genius for misdirection. He was never the man handing over the envelope, never the one signing the deal. He was always one step removed, always operating in conversations that left no record. To prosecutors, he was smoke without fire, always present, always obvious, but impossible to hold. By the mid-1960s, Sidney Korshak had become the invisible hand guiding two of America's most lucrative industries, entertainment and gambling. His network of allies, the Supermob, extended into real estate, politics, and finance. From the outside, he remained an enigma, a quiet man in a dark suit at a corner table. But inside the circles of power, everyone knew the truth. If you wanted something done, you went to Sid. And as the 60s wore on, the stakes would only grow higher. Hoffa's empire was unraveling. Las Vegas was expanding faster than anyone imagined. Hollywood was entering a new era of rebellious films and shifting power. And Korshak, always silent, always still, was at the center of it all. By the mid-1960s, one of the biggest storms swirling around Sidney Korshak's world was centered on a man as brash as Sid was quiet, Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa embodied everything the Teamsters represented: grit, loyalty, and raw intimidation. He had clawed his way from Detroit's loading docks to the presidency of the most powerful union in America. Under his command, the Teamsters pension fund became a war chest worth billions, and with it came immense leverage. For workers, it meant better pay and job security. For the outfit, it meant access to a river of cash that could finance casinos, hotels, and construction projects without the scrutiny of traditional banks. But Hoffa's power carried a cost. Federal prosecutors targeted him relentlessly, accusing him of jury tampering, fraud, and racketeering. His defiance only made him more of a target. He projected himself as untouchable, a man who could outfight both rival mobsters and the Justice Department. Yet behind the scenes, Hoffa's bravado was undermining the very network that sustained him. And it was here that Sidney Korshak played his most delicate game. Sid had no interest in headlines or showdowns. Where Hoffa thrived on confrontation, Sid thrived on silence. When the federal government indicted Hoffa, Korshak maneuvered quietly to keep the Teamsters pension pipeline flowing. When mob bosses grew impatient with Hoffa's recklessness, Sid made sure the flow of money and favors continued without interruption. It was a balancing act few could manage. Sid had to reassure Hollywood moguls that their productions would remain untouched by labor unrest. He had to reassure mob bosses that their casino investments were safe. And he had to reassure Hoffa, a man not easily reassured, that he was still in control. But in truth, Hoffa was losing control. By the late 1960s, his enemies outnumbered his allies. Robert F. Kennedy had made prosecuting him a personal crusade. Rival factions within the Teamsters were positioning themselves to replace him. And the outfit, pragmatic as always, was preparing for life without him. Sid didn't speak of it openly, but those closest to him understood. Hoffa was becoming a liability. As Hoffa's star dimmed, Hollywood's reliance on Sid only deepened. The industry was undergoing a transformation. The old studio system was collapsing under the weight of antitrust actions and cultural change. Independent productions were rising, and a new generation of filmmakers was challenging traditions. Yet amid this upheaval, one truth remained. Unions could make or break the industry. The Screen Actors Guild, the Writers Guild, the Directors Guild each had its own demands, and each could grind production to a halt. But the most explosive power still lay with IATSE, the stagehands and technical workers who could shut down entire studios in a single day. MCA, under Lew Wasserman, was the company most exposed to this risk. As it grew into a behemoth, swallowing up television contracts and dominating film distribution, it became a lightning rod for labor disputes. Yet somehow, MCA always escaped the crippling strikes that hobbled its rivals. Insiders didn't need to guess why. They knew who was making the calls, smoothing the edges, and ensuring that trouble dissolved before it boiled over. Sidney Korshak was not on MCA's letterhead, but his invisible presence was as real as the company's towering headquarters. It wasn't just unions that drew Sid's attention. He had mastered the art of weaving together Hollywood's labor stability with Las Vegas's booming casino economy. Studios sent their stars to perform at Vegas showrooms, feeding the city's image as America's playground. Casinos offered steady contracts to entertainers, generating publicity and profits. And behind both, Sid made sure that labor disputes, contract squabbles, and political inquiries never disrupted the flow of money. In this way, Hollywood and Vegas became two sides of the same coin, spinning in Sid's hand. As the 60s gave way to the 70s, the Supermob's influence extended beyond entertainment and gambling. Real estate was their next frontier. Vast stretches of Southern California, once barren land, became subdivisions, shopping centers, and freeways. The same networks that had once controlled union halls now controlled zoning boards, construction contracts, and financing deals. Investors like Henry Crown and the Pritzker family poured money into skyscrapers, hotels, and industrial projects. They built fortunes measured in billions, yet their ventures were often underwritten by the hidden capital of the outfit. Sid was the thread connecting it all, ensuring that labor stayed docile, that politicians stayed cooperative, and that the illusion of legitimacy never cracked. It was a transformation so sweeping that most Americans never saw it happening. They went to the movies, they vacationed in Las Vegas, they moved into new suburban homes, never realizing that the invisible architecture of their lives had been designed, in part, by men like Korshak. The FBI's frustration only grew. Agents tailed Sid to his usual haunts, interviewed his associates, pored over financial records. They knew he was the linchpin, the fixer who kept the outfit's interests intact across multiple industries. But every time they tried to build a case, the evidence evaporated. Witnesses grew quiet. Documents disappeared. Sid remained a ghost. To the agents, he was the embodiment of organized crime's evolution. No longer were the faces of power the Al Capones and Bugsy Siegels, loud, flamboyant, and vulnerable. Now it was men like Korshak, educated, discreet, endlessly connected. He represented the mob's graduation from the streets to the suites, from violence to influence. And yet, for all his power, Sid remained curiously anonymous. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a politician. Most Americans had never heard of him. But to those who mattered, the moguls, the bosses, the union chiefs, the senators, his name carried weight that few others could match. By the close of the 1960s, Sidney Korshak had achieved what few men in history ever could. He controlled the invisible levers of American culture, commerce, and politics, all without ever stepping into the spotlight. Jimmy Hoffa would soon vanish, swallowed by the very underworld he once commanded. But Sid endured, silent and untouchable, his power undiminished. And the Supermob, once a whisper from Chicago's Lawndale neighborhood, now stretched across the entire nation. An invisible empire built not on bullets, but on contracts, connections, and the quiet word of the man they called the Myth. The 1970s opened on an unsettled America. The optimism of the 60s had curdled into disillusionment. Vietnam was dragging on. Cities were struggling with crime and poverty. The government itself was losing credibility. Trust in institutions was fading. But for Sidney Korshak, uncertainty was not a threat. It was opportunity. This was the decade when his legend, already whispered in backrooms from Chicago to Beverly Hills, reached its full height. To moguls, to mobsters, to politicians, he was no longer simply the lawyer from Lawndale. He was the invisible guarantor of order in a world sliding toward chaos. One of the most dramatic turning points of the decade came in 1975, with the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa had been released from prison only a few years earlier, still determined to retake his old throne as president of the Teamsters. But the mob had moved on. The pension fund was still flowing, the casinos were still booming, and Hoffa's return threatened the delicate balance of power. On a July afternoon, Hoffa vanished from a parking lot in suburban Detroit. His car was found, but he was not. No body, no trial, no closure. Only silence. To the public, Hoffa's disappearance was a shocking mystery. To insiders, it was the final confirmation that the old ways of doing business were over. Hoffa had been too loud, too reckless, too visible. He believed power came from defiance. Sidney Korshak represented the opposite lesson. True power lived in silence, invisibility, and deniability. And after Hoffa was gone, it was Sid's model that prevailed. Las Vegas was the clearest example. By the 1970s, the Strip was lined with neon palaces. Caesars, the Sands, the Desert Inn, the Riviera, the Stardust. Each hotel glittered with showgirls, crooners, and gamblers. But behind the shimmering facades, the outfit and its allies still controlled the flow of money. The skim, the quiet removal of untaxed profits before the cash ever reached the books, continued like clockwork. The Teamsters Pension Fund, though officially monitored, still served as a lifeline for casino development. Loans were approved, construction surged, and profits rolled in. But the man who made sure labor unions didn't shut the doors, who reassured executives that their investments were safe, was still Sidney Korshak. He had become the indispensable middleman, the man the mob trusted to protect their cash cows, and the man legitimate businessmen trusted to keep their ventures scandal-free. It was a balancing act that no one else could perform. Hollywood, too, was changing. The old studio system had collapsed, but new power was rising in the form of blockbuster films. In 1972, The Godfather exploded onto the screen, a saga of organized crime that both romanticized and terrified audiences. Its success reshaped the industry, proving that mob stories could dominate the box office. Behind the scenes, irony hung thick. While millions marveled at fictional depictions of mafia dons, the real mob, and the real fixers like Korshak were still operating just out of sight. Hollywood may have dramatized the underworld, but Korshak was the one making sure the real underworld's grip on unions never loosened. MCA remained central to his influence. Lew Wasserman, still the most powerful man in entertainment, relied on Sid's quiet interventions whenever labor issues threatened. The unions might posture, the studios might worry, but in the end, everyone knew who could guarantee a deal. And so Korshak's legend grew, whispered in executive suites, never written in contracts. Politics, too, found itself brushing against Sid's world. Richard Nixon's White House was consumed by paranoia and scandal. Watergate revealed the depths of corruption inside Washington, and as investigators peeled back the layers, they occasionally found familiar names. The networks of money and influence that had sustained Chicago's machine and California's developers overlapped with donors and power brokers close to the Nixon administration. Sid was never dragged directly into the scandal. That was his gift. But the fact that whispers even placed him at the periphery of Watergate-era deal-making spoke volumes about how far his reach extended. Perhaps the most striking image of Korshak in the 1970s was his table at the bistro in Beverly Hills. By now, it had become a fixture of Los Angeles culture. Executives, actors, politicians, they all knew that if Sid summoned you to his table, you went. 2 telephones were permanently installed there, symbols of his role as a one-man switchboard connecting Hollywood, Las Vegas, Chicago, and Washington. The bistro was his office, his courtroom, his throne. Deals worth millions began and ended at that table, often with little more than a nod from Sid. The waiters knew never to interrupt him, and the other diners knew never to eavesdrop. He sat there like a monarch, silent but sovereign, presiding over an empire that had no borders and no constitution, only his discretion. The FBI, still watching, still compiling files, could only gnash its teeth. They called him the most powerful lawyer who never practiced law. They warned that he was the bridge between organized crime and legitimate corporations. But every time they tried to pin him down, they came up empty. Part of it was his discipline. Sid never bragged. He never left a paper trail. He never let himself be cornered. He understood that survival required not only influence but also invisibility. And so, while men like Hoffa disappeared and mob bosses were indicted, Korshak endured. Untouched, uncharged, and unchallenged. By the middle of the 1970s, Sidney Korshak stood at the very center of America's hidden power structure. He had outlasted rivals, silenced doubters, and shaped industries. He was the man who could settle a Hollywood strike before it started, the man who could channel millions into Las Vegas without a whisper of scandal, the man whose phone calls could move senators and CEOs alike. And yet, to the public, he remained a ghost. By the mid-1970s, Sidney Korshak's life was a study in contrasts. On the one hand, he lived quietly, moving between his Beverly Hills routine and discreet trips to Las Vegas and Chicago. On the other hand, his influence spanned industries, unions, and even politics. He had become indispensable, not because he ever sought publicity, but precisely because he avoided it. For many, Korshak's mystique was epitomized by his connection to Frank Sinatra. Sinatra, by then a living legend, straddled 2 worlds: the glamorous world of celebrity and the shadowy world of mob associations. His performances filled casinos, his voice defined an era, and his friendships reached the highest levels of politics. But whenever trouble brewed, an FBI inquiry, a scandal in the press, a shaky contract, it was Korshak who steadied the ground beneath Sinatra's feet. Sid was never in the spotlight, never photographed alongside the Rat Pack during their boozy stage shows at the Sands. But everyone knew, if Sinatra needed something fixed, Korshak was the man who made the call. Las Vegas itself reflected Korshak's dual role as guardian and guarantor. The Strip was a glittering empire by now, its skyline dotted with iconic casinos. The Riviera, the Stardust, Caesar's Palace, all bore the fingerprints of Teamsters' loans, outfit money, and Sid's careful oversight. Showrooms hosted Sinatra, Dean Martin, Elvis Presley, and countless others. The casinos hummed with slot machines, card tables, and high roller suites. But beneath the neon, the skim continued. Millions in cash were siphoned off before reaching the books, shipped quietly back to Chicago or hidden in offshore accounts. If regulators sniffed around, if journalists grew too curious, Korshak knew how to apply pressure or relief. His mere presence reassured mob bosses that the pipeline of profit would remain undisturbed, and it reassured legitimate investors that their stakes were protected. He was the bridge between 2 worlds that could never acknowledge each other in public. Hollywood, meanwhile, was entering its blockbuster era. The Godfather had set the stage, and now Jaws and Star Wars were rewriting the rules of the industry. Studios were consolidating, corporations were buying up entertainment empires, and billions were on the line. In this new world, labor disputes were more dangerous than ever. A single strike could derail production on films expected to gross hundreds of millions. That made Korshak more valuable than ever. He didn't just manage unions, he managed the fear of unions. Executives who might otherwise panic at the sight of picket lines knew that Sid was only a phone call away. And when he intervened, disputes melted. The irony was striking. As Hollywood made fortunes dramatizing stories of mobsters, corruption, and power, the real fixer who kept the industry alive remained invisible, seated quietly at his bistro table with 2 telephones and an unreadable expression. The Supermob, by now, was expanding beyond entertainment and casinos. Real estate, construction, and corporate America itself became their new frontier. Men like Henry Crown and the Pritzker family built conglomerates that spanned hotels, industrial giants, and financial empires. Sid didn't run these businesses, but he greased their gears. Labor peace, political access, quiet assurances of financing. These were the things he delivered. He had perfected the art of being indispensable without being official. No title, no office, no signature. Just presence. And that presence was enough to move millions. Yet even as Korshak's legend grew, so too did the attention of law enforcement. The FBI had learned from its failures in the 60s. New task forces targeted organized crime, following money trails rather than relying on informants' whispers. Senate investigations probed the Teamsters pension fund, uncovering just how deeply mob-backed loans had built Las Vegas. Korshak's name surfaced again and again in these reports. He was described as the link between the outfit and Hollywood, the man who sat between mob bosses and CEOs. But each time, the pattern repeated. No direct evidence, no charges, no courtroom drama. Sid remained untouchable. His genius was in distance. He never signed the contracts, never delivered the cash, never threatened anyone directly. He was always one step removed, his role visible only to those who already knew. For prosecutors, it was like chasing smoke. By the late 1970s, cracks were beginning to show in the old system. The outfit's grip on Las Vegas was challenged by corporate buyers and federal scrutiny. The Teamsters, now without Hoffa, found themselves under increasing government oversight. Even Hollywood's unions were evolving, less susceptible to the kinds of leverage that had once kept them pliable. But through it all, Korshak adapted. He was too disciplined, too cautious to go down with the old guard. As others were indicted, jailed, or forced into retirement, he remained in his corner booth, silent, steady, untouchable. In many ways, the 1970s represented the peak of his power. He had survived decades of upheaval, outlasted rivals, and reshaped entire industries without ever standing in the spotlight. At a time when America was questioning every institution, the presidency, the press, the unions, even the war in Vietnam, one institution remained quietly intact: Sidney Korshak's network of influence. It was an empire without borders, built not on elections or titles, but on relationships, debts, and favors. It was the invisible architecture of American power. And as the decade closed, the man who had begun life as a boy in Lawndale, the son of Russian Jewish immigrants fleeing pogroms, sat at his table in Beverly Hills, fielding calls from Hollywood moguls, Las Vegas bosses, and Washington power brokers, all of them waiting for his quiet word. By the time the 1980s arrived, America was a different country than the one that had shaped Sidney Korshak's rise. Ronald Reagan had taken the White House, promising a new conservative era. Wall Street was in full swing, turning money into power at a scale the old mob bosses could hardly imagine. Technology was beginning to reshape communications, finance, and entertainment. For Las Vegas and Hollywood, Korshak's twin kingdoms, the transformation was just as dramatic. Las Vegas had always been a paradox, a city built by mob money, yet constantly aspiring to legitimacy. For decades, the outfit and its allies had skimmed millions off the tables, funding their national empire. But by the late 1970s and early 1980s, the old model was crumbling. Federal crackdowns made skimming more dangerous. The Teamsters pension fund, once the mob's lifeline, came under tighter scrutiny, and new players, massive corporations with deep pockets and legal accounting, began moving into the Strip. The Hilton Corporation, for example, had acquired the International Hotel, rebranding it and setting a new standard for luxury. Other corporations followed, bringing not only legitimacy but also Wall Street financing. Slowly, the old mob-owned casinos gave way to corporate-controlled resorts. For the outfit, this was the beginning of the end. For Korshak, it was simply another transition to manage. He had never been sentimental about the past. Where others clung to their old rackets, he understood that survival meant adapting. If corporations wanted Las Vegas, Sid was ready to build bridges. He shifted his focus from the Underworld to Boardrooms, ensuring that the same labor peace he once guaranteed for mob-backed casinos was now guaranteed for corporate resorts. Hollywood was undergoing its own metamorphosis. The blockbuster era, born in the 1970s, was now in full bloom. Star Wars, E.T., Raiders of the Lost Ark. These weren't just movies. They were cultural phenomena, global exports worth billions. The stakes had never been higher. With those stakes came greater dependence on labor stability. Studios could not afford shutdowns. Strikes meant lost box office windows, delayed releases, and shattered marketing campaigns. That made Korshak, even in his later years, as vital as ever. Executives still whispered his name when unions threatened unrest. He still had the connections, the gravitas, the quiet menace that ensured disputes were settled before they exploded. Though he appeared less frequently in public, his health no longer allowed the same visibility. His presence was always felt. And the men who now dominated Hollywood, Wasserman, Crown, Pritzker, still knew that Sid's quiet blessing could make or break billion-dollar deals. Sid himself was aging, and his once-iron discipline was strained by declining health. He suffered from heart problems and other ailments, but he never retired. Retirement was not in his nature. His table at the bistro remained his headquarters, his 2 phones his command post. Even if his visits were less frequent, the mythology of his presence kept its power. In fact, the less he appeared, the greater his legend grew. The fewer words he spoke, the more they mattered. When he did make a call, people listened, knowing that Sid did not waste breath on trivialities. The FBI, after decades of watching him, had little to show for their efforts. Their files on Korshak filled cabinets, painting him as the essential link between organized crime and corporate America. They knew his influence extended into real estate, entertainment, labor, and politics. Yet they also knew they would never catch him. By the 1980s, the Bureau itself seemed to give up hope. The mob's old guard was collapsing under indictments, witness testimonies, and internal wars. The new threat was not gangsters in smoky back rooms, but corporate raiders in skyscrapers. And Sidney Korshak had already anticipated that shift. He was already aligned with the men who would inherit the future. One of those men was Michael Ovitz, the rising Hollywood superagent who co-founded Creative Artists Agency, CAA. In many ways, Ovitz represented the new generation. Brash, corporate, media-savvy. But even he recognized the value of Korshak's connections. The bridge from the old Hollywood to the new, from the mob-back deals to the corporate boardrooms, still ran through Sid. In this way, Korshak remained relevant to the end. He was no longer building his empire, but he was ensuring its continuity. As the Reagan years wore on, the America of Sidney Korshak's youth, the speakeasies of Chicago, the mob-backed casinos of Vegas, the union wars of Hollywood, began to feel like relics. Yet the structures he had helped build endured. Labor unions still bent to his influence. Casinos still owed their existence to Teamsters loans approved decades earlier. Hollywood still remembered who had kept the lights on during its darkest strikes. Sid had become less of a man and more of a myth, the embodiment of the idea that true power lives in silence, in the shadows, in the spaces where nothing is written down. By the mid-1980s, Sidney Korshak was slowing down, but the world around him had fully absorbed the model he had pioneered. Corporate America had replaced the mob in Las Vegas. Global media conglomerates had replaced independent moguls in Hollywood. Real estate and finance empires, many seated with money that once passed through mob hands, were reshaping skylines from Chicago to Los Angeles. Sid didn't need to be everywhere anymore. His influence lived on through the people he had cultivated, the networks he had woven. Like a spider that had built its web decades earlier, he could now rest in the center, knowing the strands still held. Las Vegas offered the clearest symbol of change. The corporations had won. The Hilton, MGM, and later Mirage resorts took over the Strip. Mob skimming, once as routine as counting cards, was vanishing under corporate accounting and federal regulation. The old bosses were dying, jailed, or irrelevant. But the truth was simple. Without Korshak, the bridge from mob money to corporate control might never have existed. He had managed the transition. He had made the introductions, smoothed the labor disputes, and reassured executives that stepping into a mob-built town wouldn't destroy their reputations. Las Vegas had gone legitimate, but it had been Sid who had midwifed that legitimacy. Hollywood, too, was almost unrecognizable. The studios of Sid's heyday had become assets of multinational corporations. MCA itself, his old cornerstone, grew into Universal, a major global player. New unions, new contracts, new rules dominated the landscape. Yet the memory of Sid's role lingered. Lew Wasserman, MCA's titan, never forgot the man who had saved his empire from crippling labor wars. Michael Ovitz, the new breed of agent, acknowledged the continuity of Sid's influence even as CAA changed the business model. Younger executives who had never sat at Sid's table still spoke of him in hushed tones, as though invoking a ghost who still haunted the industry. Even in semi-retirement, Korshak remained a presence. A call from Sid, rare though it was, could still end an argument, seal a deal, or quash a strike. But Sid himself was fading. His health, always a private matter, began to fail more noticeably. He suffered from heart disease and other ailments that limited his mobility. The bistro, once his daily headquarters, saw him less and less. Those who had once relied on the sight of him sitting at his corner table with 2 phones now relied only on memory. And yet, the absence only increased the myth. Rumors swirled. Sid was still pulling strings from his home. Sid was still in contact with the top bosses. Sid was orchestrating moves through surrogates. Whether true or not, it didn't matter. What mattered was that his legend still carried weight. The myth didn't need to be present to be effective. In the broader world, the Supermob had completed its transformation. No longer a shadowy alliance of mobsters and lawyers, it had become a set of corporate structures so vast they appeared untouchable. Towers in downtown Chicago, skyscrapers in Los Angeles, sprawling developments across California. All of it tied, in some way, to the capital flows that Sid had once guarded. The names were different now: Crown, Pritzker, Wasserman, Ovitz, but the architecture of power remained the same. Invisible connections, financial leverage, labor peace enforced by unseen hands. Sid had always understood that the future of the mob was not in the streets, but in the suites. By the 1980s, that future had arrived. To the FBI, it was both a defeat and a grudging lesson. They had spent decades chasing Korshak, compiling dossiers that read like tragic epics of near misses and half-proofs. He had been labeled the key link, the silent force, the most powerful lawyer who never practiced law. But in the end, they had nothing to show.
No indictment. No conviction.
Not even a serious trial. Sid had outlasted them. By the late 1980s, he was living in semi-seclusion, still in Beverly Hills, still in the orbit of Hollywood and Las Vegas, but no longer the daily force he had once been. Those who visited him described a man still sharp, still commanding, but slowed by time. He would reminisce sparingly, never betraying confidences, never admitting too much. His code of silence held until the end. In 1996, Sidney Korshak died at the age of 88. He had lived almost a century, spanning the rise of the outfit, the birth of Las Vegas, the golden age of Hollywood, and the corporate revolution of America. He had seen Hoffa rise and fall, mob bosses come and go, presidents inaugurated and disgraced. Through it all, he had remained a constant, silent, invisible, yet indispensable. His funeral was small, fitting his style. There were no parades, no headlines. But those who attended knew they were saying goodbye not just to a man, but to an era. With Korshak's passing, the last great bridge between the underworld and the overworld had vanished. The myth had ended, but the structures he built, the networks he wove, remained. Corporate America, Las Vegas, Hollywood, all still bore his imprint. He was gone, but his shadow lingered. By the time the 1980s closed, and Sid's story closed with them, the world he had created looked nothing like the one that had created him. And yet, his fingerprints were everywhere. In the skyscrapers, in the casinos, in the contracts, in the quiet deals that shaped America. He had always said little. But in the silence he left behind, one truth was undeniable. Sidney Korshak had been the man who proved that true power is not about being seen, but about being obeyed. To understand Sidney Korshak's legacy, you can't stop at the man himself. Korshak was the face, or more accurately, the mask of a much larger organism. That organism was what investigative journalists later called the Supermob. The Supermob wasn't a gang in the traditional sense. It wasn't a crew that met in smoky basements or carried out heists under cover of night. It was something subtler, something far more powerful. It was an alliance, a web of lawyers, financiers, developers, and politicians who moved in the gray space between the underworld and the overworld. Their genius was in laundering not just money, but legitimacy. They took mob profits from gambling, from loan sharking, from extortion, and invested them into real estate, construction, entertainment, and corporate America. And once that money was invested, it became nearly impossible to trace back to its bloody roots. Korshak was the fixer, but the empire was far bigger than him. The origins of the Supermob stretch back to Chicago in the 1930s and 1940s. As Prohibition ended and organized crime sought new arenas, Jewish and Italian mobsters recognized that brute force could only take them so far. The next step wasn't about guns. It was about lawyers, accountants, and businessmen who could convert illicit capital into enduring wealth. Here, men like Jacob Arvey, the Chicago political boss, played pivotal roles. Arvey was the ultimate machine politician. He controlled judges, prosecutors, and city contracts. He was the man who could deliver legitimacy in exchange for loyalty. Arvey's protégés, many of them Jewish lawyers from Chicago's West Side, would form the backbone of the Supermob. One of the most important of these protégés was Paul Zifrin. Zifrin was a brilliant lawyer, a strategist who later became the Democratic Party's national committeeman from California. To most, he looked like a civic leader, a patron of the arts, a respectable public figure. But beneath the polish, he carried the DNA of the machine. He understood how politics, business, and the underworld could quietly align. Another was Murray Cotiner, Richard Nixon's fixer. Cotiner, like Korshak, worked in the shadows. He was a campaign strategist, a fundraiser, a man who could connect Nixon to the money networks of California's developers and Chicago's financiers. Through Cotiner, the Supermob found a line into the White House itself. But the true titans of the Supermob weren't lawyers or politicians. They were businessmen. Take Henry Crown, for instance. Crown rose from modest beginnings in Chicago to become one of the wealthiest men in America. His company, Material Service Corporation, supplied the raw materials that built cities: gravel, cement, steel. In time, Crown's empire merged with General Dynamics, one of the largest defense contractors in the world. To the casual observer, Crown was the picture of American success. A self-made billionaire, a philanthropist, a civic leader. But Crown's empire was built with financing and protection that traced back to mob-linked networks. Teamsters' loans, outfit-friendly politicians, and men like Korshak made sure labor never disrupted his projects. Crown never needed to get his hands dirty. That was what the Supermob was for. Then there was the Pritzker family. Today, the Pritzkers are known as one of America's wealthiest dynasties, with investments spanning Hyatt hotels, manufacturing, and finance. But their early rise was fueled by the same shadow capital and connections that sustained the rest of the Supermob. The Hyatt chain, which would become a global empire, was seeded in the 1950s and 1960s with financing that bore the fingerprints of outfit money. Just as casinos laundered cash in Las Vegas, hotels laundered it across the country. And standing behind those deals were the fixers and guarantors, Korshak among them, who ensured no union would strike and no politician would interfere. The brilliance of the Supermob lay in its invisibility. Unlike traditional mobsters, who flaunted their wealth in nightclubs and mansions, the Supermob's leaders blended seamlessly into the corporate elite. They sat on boards, donated to museums, funded political campaigns. They were indistinguishable from legitimate tycoons. And that was the point. To the FBI, it was infuriating. They could indict mobsters who ran casinos or protection rackets. But how do you indict a man who owns a skyscraper or a defense company or a hotel chain? By the time the money had been washed through so many layers, there was no case to make. And so the supermob flourished, quietly shaping the landscape of post-war America. Sidney Korshak, though never the richest of them, was indispensable because of what he provided: access and protection. If Crown needed assurance that unions wouldn't derail a construction project, Sid delivered it. If the Pritzkers wanted labor peace for Hyatt, Sid smoothed it out. If MCA or Universal needed a strike shutdown, Sid picked up the phone. He was the broker of legitimacy, the man who translated underworld leverage into corporate security. By the time Sidney Korshak was at his peak, the supermob had already embedded itself into the foundations of modern America. His power didn't flow through city streets like the outfit's rackets. It flowed through skyscrapers, casinos, movie studios, and defense contracts. From Chicago to Los Angeles, the pattern repeated. Mob cash was funneled into legitimate ventures and legitimate men. Lawyers, bankers, developers protected it, expanded it, and normalized it. In Chicago, the roots ran deep. The outfit had always controlled unions, but through the supermob, that control became more sophisticated. No longer was it just about shaking down a factory or a construction site. It was about managing the entire supply chain. Gravel, steel, cement, all the raw materials that built modern cities. The outfit didn't need to own the companies outright. They had proxies like Henry Crown, who owed their rise in part to mob-aligned networks. This was the first key to the supermob's success: vertical integration of influence. They didn't just skim from the top. They owned the middle and the bottom too. From laborers on the street to executives in the boardroom, their leverage traveled up the chain. California was the second pillar. Los Angeles and Beverly Hills became the supermob's western outpost, a place where mob cash and corporate ambition found new playgrounds. Real estate was the favorite vehicle. Vast tracts of land were developed into subdivisions, shopping centers, and high-rise towers. Money flowed in from Chicago, funneled through trusts, shell companies, and friendly banks. By the time the buildings opened, the cash was clean, indistinguishable from the capital of any Wall Street firm. Hollywood was another hub. MCA, the entertainment behemoth, was protected and expanded with the supermob's help. Lew Wasserman and his successors didn't need to know every detail. They just needed to know that when unions threatened a shutdown, Sidney Korshak could fix it. That assurance was worth millions. The studios thrived. The stars thrived. And behind the curtain, the supermob's network thrived. Politics gave the supermob its shield. In Chicago, Jacob Arvey's machine delivered judges and aldermen. In California, Paul Zifrin ensured that Democrats stayed close to the developers and financiers who fueled the network. On the Republican side, Murray Cotiner's influence with Nixon meant that the supermob's allies had access at the highest level. It didn't matter which party held power. The supermob always had a seat at the table. Defense contracts marked perhaps the most striking symbol of legitimacy. Henry Crown's stake in General Dynamics, a company that built submarines, fighter jets, and missiles for the U.S. government, showed just how far the network had traveled from its street-level origins. What began as mob-connected capital in Chicago construction had become federal defense money, guaranteed by the Pentagon. Here was the brilliance of the supermob. By embedding themselves in industries vital to national security, they made themselves untouchable. To attack them would have meant destabilizing the very companies America depended on for its global military power. Critics tried to expose the network. Journalists dug. Senators held hearings. FBI agents compiled endless files. From the 1950s through the 1980s, the names came up again and again: Crown, Pritzker, Wasserman, Zifrin, Korshak. But the same pattern always held. There was smoke, but never a fire that could be prosecuted. Why? Because by the time investigators arrived, the money had already transformed. It wasn't mob cash anymore. It was real estate equity, corporate shares, legitimate profits. No jury would convict a billionaire hotel owner because the seed money of his empire came from Teamsters loans. No judge would take down a defense contractor that employed thousands of Americans because its founder once leaned on outfit-friendly unions. The supermob had built itself into the DNA of the system. Sidney Korshak's role in this web was unique. He wasn't the wealthiest nor the most public. But he was the switchboard, the man who kept the calls moving, the introductions smooth, the threats unspoken but understood. If the Supermob was an orchestra, Korshak was the conductor, making sure every instrument played in harmony without ever writing a single note of music himself. By the late 20th century, the Supermob was less a conspiracy than a legacy. The mob itself was waning, battered by RICO prosecutions and internal bloodshed. But the structures the Supermob had built, the corporations, the hotels, the skyscrapers, endured. They were no longer mob-controlled. They were American-controlled. The outfit had been absorbed into the bloodstream of capitalism. And that was perhaps the greatest irony of all. The underworld, through patience and cunning, had become indistinguishable from the overworld. The Supermob didn't end with Korshak. But with his death, one of its last great gatekeepers was gone. The new century would bring new players, new corporations, new forms of hidden power. Yet the template remained: silence, leverage, invisibility. The myth of Sidney Korshak was one man's story. The story of the Supermob was America's. Long before the neon glow of the Strip became a global icon, Las Vegas was nothing more than a desert stopover. A cluster of railroad tracks, saloons, and sand. Its destiny as America's playground was written not by geography or natural resources, but by the convergence of three forces: the mob, the unions, and the fixers who bound them together. By the 1940s, those forces had already begun shaping the desert into something extraordinary. Prohibition had taught mobsters the value of entertainment as a cover for profit. California's booming population taught developers the value of a nearby getaway. And legalized gambling in Nevada gave them the perfect stage. The Flamingo Hotel, backed by Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky, became the symbol of this transformation. Its construction was chaotic, over budget, and riddled with scandal, but it marked the beginning of an empire. And though Siegel himself was assassinated in 1947, the dream he embodied did not die. It expanded. The outfit saw in Las Vegas a machine for laundering money. Every dollar wagered could be disguised. Every casino a vault for profits too dirty to enter banks. But there was a problem. Casinos cost millions to build, and organized crime did not have endless reserves of cash. That's where the Teamsters came in. Under Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund ballooned into one of the largest pools of capital in the country. It was meant to fund retirements for truck drivers and union members. Instead, it became the mob's private bank. Loans flowed from the pension fund into Las Vegas like lifeblood. They financed the Riviera, the Stardust, Caesar's Palace. Officially, these were investments in hospitality. Unofficially, they were a money pipeline connecting blue-collar dues to mob-controlled casinos. And at the center of ensuring those loans went smoothly, that labor didn't revolt, that investors felt safe, stood men like Sidney Korshak. He didn't sign the checks, but he made sure the casinos rose without obstruction. He was the silent custodian of Las Vegas's growth. By the 1950s and 60s, the Strip was no longer just a few hotels. It was a kingdom. The Desert Inn, the Sands, the Tropicana each bore the fingerprints of mob financing. Each had a showroom that brought in the biggest stars in America: Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Elvis Presley. The symbiosis was perfect. The mob got steady income from gambling. The stars got lucrative residencies. The Teamsters collected interest on loans they barely understood. And Korshak kept the peace, ensuring that no strike, no scandal, no rogue journalist shut the lights off. But Vegas was never just glitz. Beneath the neon, the shadow economy thrived. The skim, cash taken off the top before being reported, was a science. Hidden counting rooms, unrecorded cash drops, suitcases carried out in the dead of night. Millions vanished every year, funneled back to Chicago, Kansas City, Cleveland, New York. For the FBI, Las Vegas became a puzzle. They knew the mob ran it. They knew millions were being stolen, but proving it was nearly impossible. The casinos were legitimate businesses, built with real loans, employing thousands of Nevadans. How do you prosecute an entire city? So the feds circled, frustrated, while the Strip grew brighter. Culturally, Las Vegas was unlike any other American city. It was built on illusion. The idea that you could escape your past, your debts, your life, for one weekend under the neon lights. It sold fantasy, and fantasy required secrecy. That secrecy extended not just to the gamblers, but to the city itself. It was understood what happened in Vegas stayed in Vegas. Not just the adultery or the gambling losses, but the money laundering, the skimming, the mob influence. Everyone looked the other way because everyone was making money. By the late 1960s, the federal government could no longer ignore it. Investigations into Hoffa and the Teamsters exposed how deeply the pension fund was tied to Las Vegas. Senate hearings dragged casino financing into the spotlight. Hoffa's prison sentence and eventual disappearance sent shockwaves through the system. But for Vegas itself, the machine rolled on. If anything, scrutiny only forced the mob to become more careful. That's where Korshak became invaluable. He reassured investors that despite headlines, the city's wheels would keep turning. He reassured mob bosses that corporate executives could be controlled. And he reassured Hollywood stars that the Strip would remain their safe stage. By the 1970s, Las Vegas had become a paradox. On the surface, it was America's most glamorous city, a beacon of freedom, fantasy, and entertainment. Beneath, it was still a mob fiefdom, greased by union pensions and silent fixers. And in that paradox, Sidney Korshak reigned quietly, never acknowledged, always indispensable. By the mid-1970s, cracks had begun to appear in the mob's stranglehold on Las Vegas. Federal pressure was mounting, investigative journalism was peeling back the curtain, and the culture of America was changing. The glittering Strip was still a draw, but the way it was financed and controlled was no longer sustainable. The key turning point came with the erosion of Jimmy Hoffa's empire. The Teamsters Pension Fund had been the mob's great pipeline of money, billions of dollars in worker contributions turned into casino capital. With Hoffa in prison and later vanished, federal regulators tightened control of the fund. The easy money dried up. For the outfit and its allies, that meant no more blank checks. New hotels could not be built the old way. The mob could skim, yes, but expansion was limited. Into that vacuum stepped a new breed, corporate America. Hilton was among the first. When it acquired the International Hotel and rebranded it as the Las Vegas Hilton, the message was clear. Vegas was open for business, but not just mob business. MGM followed, building massive resorts that dwarfed the old mob hotels. Other corporations soon joined, bringing Wall Street money, corporate lawyers, and accountants. The transition was gradual but unmistakable. Where once casinos had been family-style enterprises, run by mob-backed owners who answered to outfit bosses, now they were publicly traded companies with shareholder reports and compliance officers. But the transition didn't mean the mob simply vanished. For a time, the two worlds overlapped. Corporations provided the capital, but the mob still demanded its slice. And this delicate balance required someone who could speak both languages. That man was Sidney Korshak. Korshak's value was greater than ever. He reassured corporations that unions wouldn't strangle their new investments. He reassured unions that corporations would respect contracts. And he reassured the mob that they wouldn't be completely frozen out of the new Vegas order. It was a high-wire act. The mob couldn't openly confront corporate giants like Hilton. The corporations couldn't afford strikes or labor wars that would ruin the image of their shiny new resorts. And the unions, especially the Culinary Union, which fed and served the Strip, could paralyze the city if provoked. Sid stood at the crossroads, making sure none of these bombs went off. He didn't need to be in Vegas physically. His phone calls from Beverly Hills were enough. His word carried farther than any court order or shareholder vote. Meanwhile, the cultural image of Las Vegas shifted. No longer just a mobbed-up playground for gamblers and crooners, it began rebranding as a family destination, a legitimate entertainment capital. Magicians, mega-shows, and celebrity residencies replaced the smoky lounges of Sinatra's Rat Pack. This rebranding worked, and it was only possible because the corporate players brought legitimacy. But it was also only possible because the transition was kept smooth. If the mob had chosen to fight harder, or if unions had crippled the Strip, the transformation might have collapsed. Korshak's invisible hand ensured it did not. For the mob, the 1980s were a slow fade. The FBI's Strawman investigation exposed the Kansas City and Chicago mob's control of casinos. Federal indictments picked off operators. Wiretaps caught bosses discussing skimming operations. By the end of the decade, most of the old mob-owned casinos were either shuttered or sold off. But for Vegas itself, it was a rebirth. Corporate titans built even bigger resorts, turning the Strip into a global phenomenon. Billions poured in from legitimate financing. Wall Street bankers replaced mob collectors. Accountants replaced skimmers. And yet, the DNA of the city still bore the mark of its origins. Without the outfit's initial investment, without the Teamsters' loans, without the silent guarantees of men like Korshak, Las Vegas might never have existed at all. By the time Sidney Korshak himself began retreating into ill health in the 1980s, Las Vegas had already completed its metamorphosis. He had midwifed the transformation, ensuring that the city passed from mob hands into corporate hands without burning itself down in the process. It was one of his greatest feats. Not building the city, not financing it, but ensuring its survival through its most dangerous transition. When people marveled at the shimmering neon empire, they saw a monument to entertainment, to tourism, to corporate capitalism. But in truth, they were also looking at Sidney Korshak's handiwork. Las Vegas had begun as a gangster's dream. By the time Korshak's story was ending, it had become a corporate reality. And in that transformation lay the story of America itself. A nation where the line between underworld and overworld blurred, until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. When James Riddle Hoffa first emerged on the streets of Detroit in the 1930s, no one could have guessed he would become one of the most powerful men in America. Small in stature but larger than life in presence, Hoffa had an instinct for organization, for persuasion, and above all, for loyalty. The trucking industry was chaotic in those years. Drivers were poorly paid, overworked, and easily replaced. The unions that existed were fragmented, often bullied by employers or hijacked by local toughs. Hoffa thrived in this chaos. He had the street smarts to deal with gangsters, the charisma to win over workers, and the relentless drive to build something permanent. By the 1940s, he was climbing the ranks of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the union that would define his life. It wasn't long before Hoffa saw what others had missed. That control of the union meant control of an industry that touched every corner of America. If you controlled the trucks, you controlled the economy. Hoffa's genius lay in his ability to bridge two worlds. On one side, he won the fierce loyalty of his members. He fought for better wages, better hours, better conditions. To working-class truckers, he was a savior, a man who spoke their language and never abandoned them. On the other side, he struck alliances with the underworld. Hoffa understood that the mob controlled the docks, the warehouses, and the streets. Rather than fight them, he made deals. The mob wanted access to the union's pension fund, its contracts, its muscle. Hoffa wanted labor peace and enforcement. Together, they formed a partnership that reshaped the American labor landscape. By the mid-1950s, Hoffa had risen to the presidency of the Teamsters. Under his command, the union became the largest in the nation, with over 2 million members. The pension fund grew into a financial giant, amassing billions in assets. On paper, this money was meant to secure the retirements of ordinary truck drivers. In practice, it became the mob's private investment pool. Casinos in Las Vegas, skyscrapers in Chicago, real estate in Los Angeles. All of it was greased with Teamsters money. The pension fund wasn't just a safety net. It was the capital engine of the Supermob, and Hoffa sat at the controls. But Hoffa's rise brought enemies. Chief among them was Robert F. Kennedy, who became the nation's most relentless crusader against labor corruption. As chief counsel to the Senate's McClellan Committee, Kennedy grilled mobsters, union bosses, and anyone suspected of abusing power. Hoffa was his white whale. Their clashes became legendary. Kennedy, sharp and righteous, accused Hoffa of being a gangster in a union man's suit. Hoffa, combative and cunning, mocked Kennedy as a spoiled rich kid who didn't understand working men. Their duels in congressional hearings captivated the nation. To many Americans, it felt like a morality play, law and order versus corruption. To Hoffa's members, however, The attacks only made him a hero. The more Kennedy came after him, the more Hoffa looked like a champion standing up against elite power. Yet Kennedy was relentless. As Attorney General under his brother John F. Kennedy's presidency, he unleashed the full power of the Justice Department against Hoffa. Wiretaps, informants, raids, every tool was used. Eventually, the law caught up. In 1967, Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering, fraud, and misuse of the pension fund. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison. For the first time in decades, the king of the Teamsters was sidelined. But Hoffa was not a man to accept obscurity. Even behind bars, he plotted his comeback. He believed the union was his by right, and he fully intended to reclaim it once released. The mob, however, had other ideas. With Hoffa gone, new leadership had emerged, leadership that was easier to control. Frank Fitzsimmons, Hoffa's successor, was far more pliant, far less ambitious. To the mob, Fitzsimmons was perfect. To Hoffa, he was an insult. When Richard Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence in 1971, it seemed the stage was set for his return. But there was a catch. Nixon barred him from union activity until 1980. To Hoffa, that was unacceptable. He was determined to fight his way back into power, no matter who stood in his way. And standing in his way were not just rivals within the union, but mob bosses who feared what Hoffa might do if he regained control of the pension fund. The collision course was set. By the early 1970s, Jimmy Hoffa was a free man, but not the master of his empire. The Teamsters presidency belonged to Frank Fitzsimmons, a man Hoffa had once elevated but now despised. To Hoffa, Fitz was weak, indecisive, and worst of all, too cozy with the mob. From prison, Hoffa had imagined his comeback. He believed his members still loved him, that his enemies could be pushed aside, and that the pension fund would once again be under his control. But he underestimated just how much the world had changed. For the mob, Hoffa's return was a threat. They had grown comfortable with Fitzsimmons. Loans flowed with less scrutiny, skimming was easy, and the pension fund remained pliant. Hoffa, with his pride and stubbornness, threatened to disrupt this balance. If he regained power, he might cut deals on his own terms. Worse, he might retaliate against those who had abandoned him. The underworld never forgave ambition that upset the order. Hoffa didn't care. He toured union halls, made speeches, and reminded Teamsters that he had been the one who built the union into a powerhouse. His charisma was undiminished. Old loyalties stirred. His enemies took note. But Hoffa also began to air grievances publicly. He denounced Fitzsimmons. He hinted that mobsters had infiltrated the union. He even suggested he would expose the very networks that had once helped him rise. To the outfit, this was crossing a line. A man who threatened exposure was not a man they could tolerate. The summer of 1975 was when everything came to a head. Hoffa had arranged a meeting with two mob figures, Anthony Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamster leader with deep mafia ties, and Anthony Giacalone, a Detroit mob captain. The meeting, Hoffa believed, was to negotiate peace, to secure support for his return to Union power. On the afternoon of July 30th, 1975, Hoffa drove to the Machu's Red Fox restaurant in suburban Detroit. He was seen waiting in the parking lot, pacing, checking his watch. Witnesses recalled him looking agitated but determined. And then he vanished. His car was found later, unlocked, keys still inside. But Hoffa was gone. No one has seen him since. Theories abound. Some say he was lured into a car, driven to a nearby house, and killed almost immediately. Others suggest he was taken to a mob-controlled property, interrogated, and executed. Still others claim his body was incinerated in a trash compactor or buried under construction sites. From New Jersey bridges to Detroit suburbs, the truth has never been proven. What is certain is that Hoffa's disappearance was not a random act. It was the result of a decision, a calculated move by mob leaders who decided that Hoffa's return posed too great a risk. For Sidney Korshak and the Supermob network, Hoffa's death was both a tragedy and a necessity. Korshak himself was not a killer, but he understood the stakes. If Hoffa regained control, the pension fund's steady flow into casinos, hotels, and corporate deals could be disrupted. If Hoffa began talking, years of carefully hidden partnerships might unravel. Removing Hoffa protected the machine. It sent a message. No one, not even a legend, could defy the order of things. The FBI threw itself into the case. Raids, wiretaps, grand juries. None of it produced a body, a weapon, or a conviction. Every mobster questioned denied involvement. Every witness was vague. Leads dried up. And so, Hoffa's disappearance became one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. His wife never saw him again. His children grew old without answers. His union carried on without him. But Hoffa's shadow never left. He symbolized the intoxicating mix of labor power and underworld influence. He showed how unions could be both protectors of workers and gateways for corruption. He embodied both the promise of loyalty and the peril of ambition. His end, sudden, brutal, and mysterious, was a warning. In the world of the Supermob, power was never really yours. It was borrowed. And when the time came, it could be taken back without a trace. Jimmy Hoffa vanished from a Detroit parking lot, but in a sense, he never disappeared. His story remains a parable about ambition, corruption, loyalty, betrayal, and the invisible hands that shape America's hidden empires. Hollywood has always thrived on illusions. The flashing marquees, the stars shimmering on screen, the red carpets lined with photographers. All of it designed to make the business of movies look like magic. But behind the curtains, the reality was never glamorous. It was brutal, high-stakes commerce, and like every business where money flowed fast, power was often decided in smoke-filled rooms. In those rooms, few names carried more weight than Sidney Korshak. He wasn't a studio head. He wasn't a director or a producer. He didn't own a single movie theater. Yet for decades, no deal in Hollywood felt complete until it had Korshak's quiet blessing. The roots of this power went back to the 1940s and 50s, when Lew Wasserman transformed MCA, Music Corporation of America, from a talent agency into an entertainment empire. MCA represented the biggest stars, negotiated the most lucrative contracts, and eventually moved into television and film production itself. But Wasserman understood something that few others did. Hollywood's Achilles heel was labor. Strikes could cripple productions, derail schedules, and destroy profits. The Guild's actors, writers, directors, and most of all, the powerful unions like the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, IATSE, were the unpredictable wildcards in the system. To control Hollywood, you had to control labor. And that's where Sidney Korshak entered the story. Korshak had cut his teeth in Chicago, working as a labor lawyer in a city where labor disputes were never simple. Behind every picket line, there were mob interests. Behind every negotiation, there were deals that never made it onto paper. Sid had learned early that the outcome of a strike wasn't decided at the bargaining table. It was decided in the backroom, where power was brokered in whispers and handshakes. When Korshak moved west, he brought this knowledge with him. By the 1960s, he had become Hollywood's ultimate problem solver. When a studio feared a strike, they called Korshak. When an actor or agent pushed too hard, they called Korshak. When unions threatened to walk, it was Korshak who smoothed the waters before they boiled over. He wasn't loud. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't need to be. His very name carried the aura of inevitability. If Sid was involved, the deal would get done. Hollywood insiders spoke of him in half-whispers. They called him the man to see, not because he shouted, but because he didn't need to. He had the trust of both sides, the corporate executives who signed the checks, and the labor leaders who could shut the industry down. His ability to keep peace wasn't built on charm alone. It was built on leverage. Everyone knew Sid had connections, to unions, to mob families, to political fixers, and everyone knew those connections could either help or hurt. This was Korshak's genius. He made labor peace look like inevitability. And in Hollywood, inevitability was worth billions. The 1960 actors' strike was one of the first great tests of this system. It was the first time actors walked out en masse, demanding residual payments for films sold to television. For the studios, the demand was staggering. It meant giving up future profits in an industry already struggling with the new dominance of TV. For the actors, it was a matter of survival in a changing business. The strike dragged on. Tensions rose. Millions of dollars were at stake. And then, behind the scenes, Korshak moved. He spoke to Wasserman. He spoke to union leaders. He reminded everyone what chaos would mean. The strike ended with an agreement that reshaped Hollywood. Actors won residuals, but studios kept their production schedules intact. No one put Sid's name in the headlines, but everyone in the business knew he had been the invisible hand that forced compromise. From that point on, his role only grew. Korshak became the go-to man whenever Hollywood faced disruption. In the 1970s, when television writers struck for better pay, it was Korshak who worked the phones. When the studios faced demands from set builders, electricians, and grips, it was Korshak who soothed tempers. He didn't sign contracts. He didn't sit at the bargaining table. But he didn't have to. Deals were preset by the time negotiations began, because Sid had already mapped them out in private. But Hollywood wasn't just about labor disputes. It was also about deals, mergers, acquisitions, partnerships that involved millions, sometimes billions of dollars. And Korshak's fingerprints were often on these too. When Universal merged with MCA, when stars negotiated record-breaking contracts, when television networks fought over rights, Sid was the man in the middle. Always unseen, always indispensable. The irony was that most of the stars whose careers depended on these deals never knew his name. Moviegoers watching John Wayne or Elizabeth Taylor or Robert Redford had no idea that the contracts making those films possible had passed through Korshak's shadowy influence. That was exactly how he liked it. Sid didn't crave fame. He craved power, and power worked best when invisible. By the 1970s, Hollywood had become a global industry. Blockbusters like Jaws and Star Wars turned movies into worldwide events, with profits stretching across continents. This raised the stakes higher than ever. A strike wasn't just a local inconvenience anymore. It was a potential global catastrophe. And once again, Korshak was the quiet guardian who ensured the money kept flowing. Hollywood executives toasted themselves at premieres and banquets, but many of them knew the truth. None of it would have been possible without the silent man at the bistro table in Beverly Hills, who made sure no one pulled the plug on the dream factory. Hollywood has always been a city of myths, not just the stories told on screen, but the myths about how power itself works. To outsiders, power seemed to rest with the stars, those luminous figures whose faces filled the world's theaters. To insiders, it seemed to belong to the studio heads and producers who financed the films. But those who knew the inner circles whispered of another layer, one that never appeared on marquees. That layer was Sidney Korshak. Korshak's world was the corner booth at the bistro restaurant in Beverly Hills, or a suite at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He didn't need an office with his name on the door. His office was wherever he sat. Executives and agents came to him, knowing that decisions made in his presence had a way of becoming reality. The most powerful men in Hollywood gravitated to him. Lew Wasserman at MCA Universal, Kirk Kerkorian, who bought and sold studios like Poker Chips, Jack Warner, Daryl Zanuck, men who had built Hollywood itself, all at one point or another sought Korshak's advice, or at least his blessing. What made him indispensable was not simply charm, or even intelligence. It was that Korshak offered something no one else could: certainty. If Sid said a deal would go through, it did. If he said a strike would end, it ended. He didn't make idle promises. He dealt in guarantees. The agents knew it too. Hollywood was, and still is, a town run by agents. They packaged films, put stars together with directors, and negotiated the deals that made or broke careers. But agents often fought among themselves, jockeying for leverage, for percentages, for dominance. Korshak was the quiet referee. When tempers flared, he was the one who made sure blood wasn't drawn. To many in Hollywood, Korshak became known simply as the Fixer, not because he was flashy, but because he seemed to operate with a kind of inevitability. If there was chaos, he ended it. If there was a deadlock, he broke it. If there was a threat, it faded once it got involved. Of course, whispers followed him. Everyone knew his roots were in Chicago. Everyone knew he had ties to labor unions that had long been influenced by organized crime. Everyone knew that behind his quiet smile were darker loyalties. But in Hollywood, results mattered more than rumors. The moguls, for all their power, lived in constant fear of disruption. Korshak removed that fear, and in exchange they gave him access, not formal titles, not public recognition, but something far more valuable: trust. By the late 1970s, Korshak's role had evolved from fixer to gatekeeper. Big corporate players were moving into Hollywood, just as they had in Las Vegas. Insurance companies, banks, conglomerates, all wanted a piece of the entertainment boom. But they didn't understand Hollywood's fragile ecosystem of egos, unions, and unwritten rules. Korshak did. So when outsiders came to town, Korshak was often their guide. He could introduce them to the right people, warn them about the wrong ones, and ensure their money didn't vanish in lawsuits or strikes. In effect, he became Hollywood's silent ambassador, the man who translated between Wall Street's cold logic and Hollywood's chaotic passions. His influence seeped into the culture itself. Movie stars, though rarely in direct contact with him, felt the stability he created. Productions didn't collapse under labor unrest. Studios didn't implode from endless lawsuits. Agents could negotiate fiercely, knowing there was always a floor beneath the fight. In a town built on fantasy, Korshak provided something real: continuity. Yet this continuity came at a cost. Some in Hollywood resented the idea that their industry depended on a man whose power was built in the shadows. Journalists occasionally probed, asking why Korshak, who held no official position, seemed to wield such authority. But those stories rarely stuck. Sources dried up, leads went nowhere, and in the end, the public didn't want to know. Hollywood's glamour depended on ignorance. If the movies kept rolling, if the stars kept shining, who cared who held the strings? By the 1980s, Korshak's health was declining, but his influence remained. He was no longer as active, but his legend had already been sealed. For decades, he had been the man who ensured Hollywood never descended into chaos. The industry owed him more than it would ever admit. And so, when Korshak finally began to retreat from the scene, Hollywood kept moving, smoother, stronger, more corporate than ever. The foundations he had laid held firm. Looking back, it's easy to think of Hollywood as a place run by artists, directors, and dreamers. But the reality was far more complicated. Beneath the spotlight, beneath the billboards, there were men like Sidney Korshak, men who never appeared on screen, but whose quiet phone calls shaped the destiny of an industry that defined American culture. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, America was undergoing a transformation. The post-war boom had created unprecedented prosperity, but it had also concentrated wealth and power in new ways. The mob's casinos and Hollywood studios were only pieces of a larger puzzle. The real game was in the boardrooms, banks, insurance companies, and real estate empires that quietly shaped the economy of the nation. And as always, the men behind the Supermob understood this. They had built their fortunes on land deals, loans, and unions. Now, with billions at their disposal, they sought to translate that shadow power into something more permanent, something that looked legitimate. Sidney Korshak was at the center of this evolution. For most of his career, Korshak had been a bridge between unions and employers, between mobsters and moguls, between the streets and the suites. But now he was something even more important: a guarantor. To banks and corporations, Korshak offered what money alone could not buy: peace. He could assure them that investments wouldn't be sabotaged by strikes. He could guarantee that developers would get their permits, that construction would proceed without accidents, that deals would be honored. His word, delivered from a corner booth in Beverly Hills or over the phone, carried more weight than legal contracts. In return, corporations embraced him. Not publicly, never publicly, but in private, Korshak was courted, consulted, and trusted. The real estate boom was where this power first became visible. Cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas were exploding with new development. Skyscrapers rose, suburbs sprawled, freeways cut across the land. Developers needed financing, permits, and above all, labor cooperation. That cooperation often came at a price. Unions controlled who poured the concrete, who laid the steel, who wired the buildings. A strike could freeze a project worth millions. An accident could derail it entirely. Developers learned quickly. If you wanted certainty, you called Sid. And so, projects that seemed impossible suddenly sailed through. Towers rose without delay. Deals closed smoothly. And always, the unseen hand of the supermob ensured a cut of the profits. Insurance was another frontier. On the surface, it seemed dry, bureaucratic, even boring. But insurance companies controlled vast pools of capital that could be loaned, invested, leveraged. To gain access to those pools was to gain entry into one of the most powerful engines of capitalism. Through their allies, the supermob found ways to tap into this system. Pension funds, insurance pools, and union reserves were steered into projects that enriched both corporations and their hidden partners. What began as mob money in cash-filled envelopes was laundered into the very bloodstream of corporate America. Banks followed a similar pattern. In the old days, mobsters had relied on loan sharks and backroom lenders. But the supermob wasn't content with that. They wanted Wall Street. They wanted the legitimacy of big banks, and they got it. With Korshak smoothing introductions, with unions providing leverage, with politicians quietly persuaded, mob-connected money flowed into mainstream banking. In some cases, banks didn't even know the full story. In others, executives simply chose not to ask questions. The line between Underworld and Overworld blurred until it disappeared entirely. This was the genius of the supermob. They didn't just steal or skim. They embedded themselves into the system so deeply that removing them would have meant ripping out the arteries of American finance itself. By the 1970s, when an office tower went up in Chicago, when a hotel was built in Los Angeles, when a casino was financed in Las Vegas, odds were good that supermob money was somewhere in the mix. And behind it all, somewhere in the shadows, was Sidney Korshak. Nodding, smoothing, approving, ensuring. As the supermob's money seeped deeper into banks, real estate, and insurance, one truth became unavoidable. Corporations did not exist in a vacuum. They depended on government for contracts, for regulation, for tax breaks, for protection. And if the supermob wanted to protect its investments, it had to have a presence in Washington. This was not about bribery in the crude sense. It wasn't about stuffing envelopes into a politician's pocket, though that happened often enough. It was about relationships. The kind of relationships Sidney Korshak specialized in. Korshak never ran for office. He didn't lobby openly. But his phone calls reached congressmen, senators, governors, even presidents. He had what politicians craved. Money, influence, and the ability to solve problems that no one wanted to talk about. If a campaign needed financing, Korshak's network could provide it. If a construction project required federal permits, Korshak could smooth the path. If a political ally faced a labor revolt at an inconvenient moment, Korshak could make the picket lines vanish overnight. Politicians might not have wanted to admit it, but many owed him favors. And in Washington, favors were currency more valuable than dollars. By the late 1960s, this influence extended into the heart of government contracts. Construction firms with mob ties won lucrative federal deals. Developers secured access to government land. Banks linked to the network found themselves courted for public financing projects. Was it illegal? Often it skirted the line. Was it effective? Absolutely. And behind these victories was a man who never appeared in the photographs, Sidney Korshak. His influence was never clearer than in the quiet fear he inspired. Executives who might scoff at regulators, who might argue with shareholders, rarely dared to defy Korshak. They knew better. His power didn't come from holding office. It came from his ability to reach into every corner. Unions, corporations, mob families, political machines. If you crossed him, the consequences weren't spelled out. They didn't have to be. Maybe your project stalled. Maybe your permits vanished in bureaucratic limbo. Maybe your shareholders suddenly turned against you. Maybe the unions went on strike at the worst possible time. Korshak didn't need to threaten. Reality itself seemed to bend in his favor. This aura of inevitability made him indispensable. To corporations, he was insurance against chaos. To politicians, he was a fixer who could deliver labor peace and campaign money. To mob bosses, he was the respectable face who ensured their profits were protected. Korshak stood at the nexus of these forces, invisible yet unavoidable. He didn't just connect underworld and overworld anymore. He was the hinge between corporate America and the government itself. Of course, this created tension. Journalists occasionally stumbled upon hints of his influence. Senate committees whispered about hidden corruption in labor and construction. FBI agents gathered files with his name on them. Yet time and again, nothing stuck. Why? Because Korshak never left fingerprints. He didn't sign contracts. He didn't make threats. He simply arranged outcomes. And outcomes, after all, are difficult to prosecute. By the 1970s, America had become a corporate nation, its wealth concentrated in sprawling conglomerates, its politics shaped by big donors, its cities reshaped by billion-dollar projects. And in this new order, the supermob was no longer on the margins. It was woven into the very fabric of the system. The men who had once been dismissed as gangsters now sat, through proxies and investments, inside the machinery of American capitalism. Their influence was hidden, but their fingerprints were everywhere. And Sidney Korshak remained the quiet guardian of this empire, the man who ensured that the supermob's rise into the corporate boardrooms of America went unchallenged, unseen, and uninterrupted. The 1970s in America were an age of unraveling. The optimism of the post-war boom had faded. Vietnam dragged on, riots scarred the cities, inflation choked the economy. At the center of this storm stood Richard Nixon, a president who had built his career on toughness, secrecy, and the belief that power was something to be held at all costs. And hovering around his presidency, though rarely mentioned in the history books, were the quiet shadows of men like Sidney Korshak and the network of the supermob. To understand their connection, you have to understand Nixon's world. Nixon distrusted traditional elites. He loathed the Ivy League establishment, the liberal press, the Kennedys with their inherited glamour. He preferred allies who, like him, had clawed their way up. Men who understood loyalty, leverage, and survival. The supermob spoke that same language. They weren't aristocrats. They weren't philosophers. They were dealmakers, fixers, survivors. And Nixon, for all his public crusades against corruption, found himself orbiting the very networks that men like Korshak represented. Money was the first point of contact. Campaigns were expensive, and Nixon's political machine was ravenous. By the late 1960s, the Teamsters Union had become one of his key sources of support. Frank Fitzsimmons, Hoffa's pliant successor, delivered not just endorsements but financial backing. And behind the Teamsters, quietly, were the men who managed the pension funds and made sure the money flowed into the right campaigns. Hoffa himself, sitting in prison in the late 1960s, had lobbied for Nixon's help. When Nixon commuted his sentence in 1971, eyebrows were raised. Why would the law and order president release a man widely regarded as corrupt? The answer was as old as politics itself. Deals had been made. And in the background of those deals were lawyers, fixers, and intermediaries. Men like Korshak who could bridge the gap between unions, mob interests, and the White House. But Nixon's ties to this world went beyond the Teamsters. Las Vegas, by then, had become America's playground, fueled by Teamster pension loans and mob investments. Casinos were cash machines, spitting out profits that could be steered into politics. Nixon's associates cultivated friendships with casino owners and financiers. And though Nixon himself never dealt directly with mobsters, his operatives often found themselves in rooms where Korshak's name carried weight. For Nixon, the calculus was simple. Politics required money. Money flowed most easily through channels no one wanted to examine too closely. And if men like Korshak ensured that flow, so be it. Then came Watergate. What began as a botched burglary at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in 1972 spiraled into the greatest political scandal in American history. Nixon's obsession with loyalty, secrecy, and control had finally backfired. As investigators peeled back the layers, they uncovered a White House consumed by paranoia. Enemies lists, wiretaps, slush funds, hush money. And once again, the shadows of the supermob flickered at the edges. Hush money, the lifeblood of any scandal, had to come from somewhere. Tracing the origins of those funds led investigators into a maze of campaign accounts, corporate contributions, and union backing. While no court ever proved direct mob financing of Watergate, the networks were close enough that the possibility couldn't be dismissed. Even more telling was the cast of characters surrounding Nixon. Men like Murray Cotiner, Nixon's longtime political fixer, had deep ties to Los Angeles business circles that overlapped with Korshak's. Others in Nixon's orbit were known to mingle with casino operators, labor leaders, and financiers connected to Teamster loans. The lines between politics, organized crime, and corporate America blurred until they were indistinguishable. Nixon himself may not have known every detail, but the system that sustained him, the money, the deals, the guarantees, was the same system that sustained the Supermob. Korshak and his allies thrived in that environment. They didn't need to break into offices. They didn't need to run campaigns. They simply ensured that the machinery of power never ran dry. By the time Watergate forced Nixon's resignation in 1974, America had been given a rare glimpse into the hidden mechanics of its own government. The hearings, the tapes, the revelations, they showed how loyalty, secrecy, and money had become entangled at the highest level. But even in that blaze of exposure, one truth remained obscured. The deeper networks, the men like Korshak who had long mastered the art of staying invisible. On August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon walked out of the White House for the last time as president. The helicopter lifted off from the South Lawn, carrying with it the man who had once held the most powerful office in the world, now undone by tapes, cover-ups, and a burglary that spiraled into a constitutional crisis. To millions of Americans, Nixon's fall was a moment of reckoning. It seemed to prove that no man, not even a president, was above the law. Watergate was framed as a cleansing moment, a triumph of transparency over secrecy. But for those who lived in the world of Sidney Korshak, the lesson was more complicated. Yes, Nixon had been exposed. Yes, his inner circle had been shattered. But the networks that had sustained him, the unions, the financiers, the corporations, the intermediaries like Korshak, remained intact. If anything, their power was growing. Because while Nixon was gone, the system was still there. The campaign money still had to flow. The deals still had to be made. And those who knew how to move in the shadows still thrived. Korshak, for his part, emerged from the Nixon years without a scratch. He had never been dragged before a committee. He had never been forced to testify. His name appeared in FBI files, in whispered reports, in the private suspicions of investigators, but never in a courtroom. That was his art. He was everywhere and nowhere at once. The collapse of Nixon's presidency also revealed something deeper: the limits of exposure. Watergate had pulled back the curtain on corruption in politics. Americans had seen how loyalty and money could distort democracy. But they had only glimpsed the surface. The Supermob operated below that surface. It didn't rely on elections. It didn't need campaigns. It wasn't vulnerable to scandals broadcast on television. Its strength came from being embedded in the structure of American business itself. You could topple a president. You couldn't topple a system that had quietly fused organized crime with corporate power. In fact, the years after Nixon were boom years for the Supermob. With the presidency weakened, corporations moved aggressively to consolidate power. Mergers accelerated. Real estate projects expanded. Wall Street became hungrier, more creative, more ruthless. And in that environment, men like Korshak were invaluable. Labor peace was still necessary. Union pension funds were still vast. Developers still needed certainty. Politicians still needed financing. And Korshak was still the man who could provide all of it, without ever leaving fingerprints. Even more striking was the contrast in perception. Nixon's tapes made him seem petty, paranoid, clumsy. His enemies' list, his rambling conversations, his obsession with control, all exposed for the world to see. Korshak, by contrast, remained untouchable. He left no tapes. He kept no lists. He trusted no microphones. Where Nixon was noisy, Korshak was silent. Where Nixon fell, Korshak endured. It was a lesson in the true nature of power. Presidents could win elections, but elections ended. Political careers rose and fell in public. But the quiet networks beneath, the men who never ran for office, who never appeared on ballots, who never had to answer questions from voters, they endured from decade to decade. By the end of the 1970s, as America struggled with oil crises, inflation, and political disillusionment, the supermob had never been stronger. They had survived Hoffa. They had survived Watergate. They had survived the fall of Nixon. And Sidney Korshak remained, as always, at the center. Not celebrated, not elected, not even widely known, but indispensable. Watergate had taught America to look for corruption in the Oval Office, in campaign donations, in political operatives. But the real story was deeper. The true machinery of hidden power didn't live in Washington alone. It lived in the connections between unions, corporations, and the underworld, connections that no scandal, no resignation, no helicopter flight to San Clemente could sever. By the end of the 1970s, Las Vegas was at a crossroads. For decades, the desert city had been a mob town. Its neon lights and casino floors were fueled by Teamster pension loans, hidden schemes, and suitcases of untraceable cash. The mob's presence wasn't subtle. It was baked into the very DNA of the Strip. But America was changing. Law enforcement had become more aggressive. The FBI had begun targeting organized crime with new tools: wiretaps, RICO statutes, undercover informants. The press had grown bolder, exposing connections between mob families and casino bosses. Politicians, eager to show toughness, promised a crackdown. The message was clear. The mob's open grip on Las Vegas had reached its limit. For many, this seemed like the end of an era. Federal raids hit casinos. Grand juries issued indictments. Names like Frank Rosenthal, Tony Spilatro, and other notorious mob figures became headlines. By the early 1980s, Las Vegas was rebranded as a city under new management. But the story was more complicated. While the mobsters with flashy reputations faced pressure, the deeper networks adapted. The supermob, the financiers, lawyers, and silent partners didn't need to sit at the blackjack tables or threaten casino managers in public. They operated behind the scenes in boardrooms and law offices. And when Las Vegas shifted from mob town to corporate playground, they shifted with it. The key was corporate ownership. In the old days, casinos were run by individuals or partnerships, often backed by mob money. But by the late 1970s, large corporations began moving in. Hilton bought casinos. MGM expanded. Major hotel chains, insurance companies, and entertainment conglomerates snapped up properties. This was presented as a cleansing. Out with the mob, in with the respectable suits. Out with the skim, in with audited profits. Out with the whispers, in with shareholder reports. But behind the corporate logos, many of the same networks remained. The transition was less a purge than a transfer. Where once mob families had held influence directly, now their allies and intermediaries, lawyers, consultants, fixers, ensured that corporate interests didn't cut them out entirely. Sidney Korshak was central to this process. He had been the bridge between unions, Hollywood, and corporate America. Now he became the bridge between Las Vegas and Wall Street. When corporations moved into Nevada, Korshak smoothed the way. He could guarantee labor peace. He could ease regulatory concerns. He could assure investors that their billion-dollar projects wouldn't be derailed by hidden obstacles. To outsiders, it looked like a clean break. To insiders, it was continuity in a new suit. The casinos themselves changed. Where once the Stardust or the Tropicana catered to gamblers looking for action, the new model aimed higher. Resorts were built with thousands of rooms, massive entertainment complexes, and family-friendly marketing. The goal was not just gambling but tourism, conventions, concerts, and experiences that brought in Middle America. The mob's version of Vegas had been raw, cash-heavy, and intimate. The corporate version was polished, professional, and massive. But the money behind it still flowed through many of the same channels. In this new environment, the supermob found opportunity. Real estate was booming. Construction contracts for the new mega-resorts were worth hundreds of millions. Financing deals involved banks, insurance companies, and union funds. Every step of that process offered leverage that men like Korshak knew how to turn into profit. And while FBI agents chased mobsters in flashy suits, the real power had already shifted to men who didn't need to show their faces in a casino. The FBI's war on Las Vegas came to a head in the early 1980s. Their targets were the visible mob figures, the Frank Rosenthals who ran casinos, the Tony Spilatros who enforced discipline with violence. Rosenthal, a Chicago bookmaker, had become the secret mastermind behind several casinos, including the Stardust. On paper, he was just a consultant. In reality, he controlled the flow of money, the hiring, the games themselves. Spilatro, meanwhile, handled enforcement. He was feared across Vegas for his ruthlessness, the man who made sure no one crossed Chicago's interests. Together, they represented the last gasp of the mob's open grip on the Strip. The FBI hit them hard. Wiretaps, raids, indictments, the full arsenal of federal power. The Chicago outfit's skimming operations, long and open secret, were finally exposed in courtrooms. Executives were indicted. Dealers were flipped as witnesses. Rosenthal's name became front-page news. In 1982, Rosenthal survived a car bombing outside a Las Vegas restaurant, a clear sign that the old mob ways were unraveling. The bombing didn't kill him, but it did end his reign. Spilatro fared even worse. By the mid-1980s, his brutality had drawn so much heat that even the mob considered him a liability. In 1986, Spilatro and his brother were found murdered in an Indiana cornfield, buried in shallow graves. To law enforcement and the press, this was victory. The mob was broken. Las Vegas, they claimed, had been liberated. But in truth, the fall of Rosenthal and Spilatro only confirmed what insiders already knew. The mob's street-level control was obsolete. The future of Las Vegas belonged to corporations, not hitmen. And the Supermob had already made the transition. While FBI agents celebrated arrests, the real money flowed into gleaming new resorts, the Mirage, Caesars expansions, MGM Grand. These projects required massive financing, far beyond what mobsters with skim cash could provide. Banks, Wall Street firms, and corporate investors became the new lifeblood of the Strip. But those institutions didn't enter Las Vegas blindly. They needed guides. They needed men who understood how to tame unions, how to navigate regulators, how to guarantee peace in a city built on constant tension. That was where the Supermob excelled. Sidney Korshak, by then older and in declining health, remained a quiet presence. His phone calls still carried weight. His introductions still mattered. Even if he no longer roamed the casinos, his network ensured that corporate Vegas remained connected to the same channels of influence that had built Mob Vegas. The mob may have been pushed out of the spotlight, but the money men, the lawyers, consultants, developers, and hidden partners were still there. They had traded smoky backrooms for glossy boardrooms, but the game remained the same. For tourists, the transformation was dazzling. The Vegas of the 1980s and 1990s promised glamour, spectacle, and safety. Families could bring children. Conventions flocked to cavernous halls. Celebrities performed for crowds that once would have seemed unimaginable. But beneath the neon and the marble lobbies, continuity hummed. The labor unions were still tied to hidden interests. The financing of resorts still drew from union funds and shadowy investors. The corporations that took over often relied on intermediaries whose loyalty stretched back decades. The mob had been beaten. The supermob had simply evolved. This was the enduring lesson of Las Vegas. Power doesn't disappear, it adapts. The faces change, the structures evolve, but the networks remain. By the time the FBI declared victory, by the time Spilatro's body was pulled from the dirt, the supermob had already secured its place in the corporate Vegas of the future. The 1980s were a decade of excess. America, weary of the cynicism of Watergate and the economic malaise of the 1970s, turned its eyes to money. Wall Street became a cultural icon. Its traders lionized, its profits celebrated. The new mantra was simple: greed was good. But behind the glossy magazine covers and the swagger of investment bankers, another story unfolded. Because the financial tools that drove the decade, junk bonds, leveraged buyouts, hostile takeovers, were not just Wall Street innovations. They were also opportunities for networks like the Supermob, who had spent decades mastering the quiet art of leverage. At the center of this transformation was Michael Milken, the so-called junk bond king. His strategy was simple but revolutionary. finance corporate takeovers with high-yield bonds, instruments that traditional bankers dismissed as too risky. By pooling investors and exploiting appetite for returns, Milken unlocked billions of dollars for companies to expand or to swallow their rivals. Overnight, industries were reshaped, conglomerates formed, old corporations crumbled, fortunes were made, and in this chaos, the supermob saw its chance. Sidney Korshak, though aging and no longer the vigorous operator he had been, still had his network. And his network understood better than anyone that money didn't have to be clean to be powerful. Pension funds, insurance pools, real estate investments, all the traditional vehicles the supermob had tapped for decades, suddenly became tools in the junk bond revolution. Where unions once financed casinos, now their funds financed Wall Street deals. Where insurance reserves once built hotels, now they fueled corporate raids. It was the same game played with new cards. Corporate raiders became the new celebrities. Men like Carl Icahn, T. Boone Pickens, and Ronald Perelman were hailed as financial geniuses. They bought companies with borrowed money, gutted them, sold off assets, and walked away with millions. To the public, they were sharks swimming in a free market ocean. But what most people never saw was the infrastructure beneath them, the lawyers, consultants, and intermediaries who smoothed the path, who arranged financing, who handled labor issues when companies were broken apart. That was the terrain the supermob had always dominated. The cultural shift was profound. In the old mob days, wealth was hidden, skimmed from casinos, carried in envelopes, laundered through side deals. In the 1980s, wealth was flaunted. Yachts, mansions, private jets, the spoils were displayed proudly. But behind the glitz, the mechanics of power hadn't changed. The networks still controlled the flow of money. Only now, instead of smoky casinos in Las Vegas, the deals were happening in skyscrapers on Wall Street. And once again, the genius of Sidney Korshak was in adaptation. He didn't have to understand the intricacies of junk bonds. He only had to understand people, the men who needed introductions, the corporations that needed labor peace, the investors who needed assurance that their deals wouldn't collapse under hidden pressures. He had been doing that for decades. The tools had changed. The game had not. The 1980s had begun in triumph for Wall Street's new titans. Corporate raiders strutted. Junk bonds fueled an endless carousel of takeovers, and fortunes seemed limitless. But by the end of the decade, the same excess that made men rich was dragging them down. The headlines began to turn. Insider trading scandals rocked the markets. Names like Ivan Boesky and Dennis Levine, once hailed as visionaries, were suddenly mugshots on evening news broadcasts. And at the center of it all stood Michael Milken, the junk bond king himself, indicted on charges of securities fraud. The empire of leveraged buyouts was collapsing under its own weight. For many of the corporate raiders, it was a spectacular fall. Icahn survived. Pickens receded. Perelman stumbled. Boesky went to prison. Milken, once worth billions, faced a humiliating prosecution that symbolized the end of an era. But for the supermob, it was just another cycle. The lesson they had always understood was this: public figures take the fall, but networks endure. When junk bonds crashed, when leveraged empires crumbled, when the markets convulsed, the lawyers and consultants who had arranged the deals simply shifted clients. The union pension funds still existed. The insurance pools still held billions. The real estate projects still needed labor peace. The players changed. The game went on. Korshak's network had weathered worse storms. They had survived Hoffa's downfall. They had survived Nixon's resignation. They had survived the mob wars of Las Vegas. The collapse of junk bonds was just another correction in the market. If anything, it opened new opportunities. Bankrupt corporations needed rescuing. Distressed assets were suddenly available at fire sale prices. For those with liquidity, and for those with connections, it was a feeding frenzy. And the supermob always had connections. As Milken faced trial, as Wall Street reeled, Korshak himself was nearing the end of his life. He was older, his health fading. He no longer prowled the Beverly Hills hotels where he once held court with moguls and movie stars. But even in decline, his aura remained. His phone still rang. His name still commanded respect, even fear, because by then it wasn't just about Korshak as a man. It was about the system he embodied. The true legacy of the 1980s was not the rise and fall of junk bonds. It was the confirmation of a deeper truth. Finance had become the new battlefield of power, and networks like the Supermob had embedded themselves too deeply to be uprooted. The mobsters of the 1950s had skimmed from casinos. The raiders of the 1980s had skimmed from corporations. Both left wreckage behind. But the hidden brokers, the men in the shadows, endured. By the dawn of the 1990s, Wall Street was battered but not broken. The scandals had produced trials, convictions, headlines. But the larger system, the fusion of capital, unions, corporations, and political influence, remained untouched. And once again, the lesson was clear. Public faces are expendable. Hidden power is not. Hollywood has always been a city of illusions. On the screen, the images were glamorous, larger than life, untouchable. Behind the screen, the reality was often messy. Strikes, lawsuits, broken contracts, bruised egos, and standing between those two worlds, smoothing, fixing, controlling, was Sidney Korshak. By the 1980s, Korshak was no longer just a lawyer with mob ties. He was the man who could make or break a deal in Hollywood. Studio executives, agents, actors, producers, all knew that if Korshak made a call, the smart move was to listen. His power came from one simple fact. He controlled labor. Hollywood might have been a dream factory, but it was also a union town. Every film required crews, drivers, electricians, stagehands, makeup artists, projectionists. If the unions walked, the cameras stopped. And Korshak, through decades of connections to the Teamsters and other guilds, could guarantee labor peace or unleash chaos. That leverage made him indispensable. But labor was just the start. By the 1980s, Hollywood itself was being swallowed by corporations. The studios that had once been family businesses were acquired by conglomerates, banks, and multinational companies. MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, these were no longer just movie studios. They were financial assets. And whenever a corporate giant looked westward toward Hollywood, it found the same roadblock: how to manage an industry run on ego, unions, and unpredictable stars. That's when Sidney Korshak's phone would ring. Korshak became the translator between Wall Street and Hollywood. He could reassure corporate boards that their investments wouldn't collapse in strikes. He could whisper in a producer's ear to accept a deal. He could nudge an agent into dropping a lawsuit. He didn't need to own a studio. He owned the trust of the people who made the system function. And in an industry where time was money, trust was everything. The irony was that Korshak never sought publicity. He never wanted his name in Variety. He rarely attended premieres. He wasn't photographed at Oscars after-parties. But in the lobbies of Beverly Hills hotels, in discreet lunches at power restaurants, his presence loomed larger than any studio head. Executives might hold the titles. Stars might draw the crowds. But Korshak held the strings. By the mid-1980s, this influence was legendary. Jack Valenti of the Motion Picture Association, Lou Wasserman of MCA, producers and agents who shaped the blockbuster era, all knew Korshak's number. A single phone call from him could settle disputes that otherwise would drag through courts for years. He was, in effect, Hollywood's invisible studio boss. The Hollywood of the 1990s was a very different place from the Hollywood of the 1940s that Sidney Korshak first stepped into. Back then, studios were family dynasties, unions were battlegrounds, and mobsters lurked behind the scenes of labor disputes. By the 1990s, the industry had become a global business. Studios were owned by conglomerates in New York, Tokyo, Paris. Blockbusters dominated the box office, fueled by merchandising, fast food tie-ins, and worldwide releases. Talent agencies had become as powerful as studios, packaging actors, directors, and scripts into deals worth hundreds of millions. And yet, in the middle of this transformation, one truth had not changed. Sidney Korshak's phone still mattered. He was older now, his health failing, but his reputation was carved into stone. When a labor issue threatened to derail a film, Korshak's call could fix it. When a corporate merger raised fears of Hollywood unrest, Korshak reassured the boardrooms. When egos clashed, and in Hollywood, they always clashed, Korshak could calm the waters. His genius was never in contracts or law books. It was in people. He knew what each side wanted, what they feared, and how far they could be pushed. He made deals not with paper, but with trust born of decades of results. The rise of talent agencies in the 1990s only deepened his relevance. Agencies like CAA, Creative Artists Agency, were reshaping Hollywood, packaging stars and projects into blockbuster deals. But even the most powerful agents needed assurance that their packages wouldn't unravel in a strike or collapse in litigation. Korshak was the insurance policy, the quiet guarantee that the machinery would run smoothly. In many ways, he had become the hidden backbone of the blockbuster era. Hollywood's globalization also played into his hands. As studios pushed into foreign markets, they needed to navigate new unions, new governments, new obstacles. Korshak's network, stretching from Chicago to Beverly Hills, from Las Vegas to New York, gave him the credibility to broker introductions and smooth transitions. If a corporation in Tokyo or Paris wanted to understand Hollywood, they inevitably found their way to Korshak's circle. He didn't need to leave Los Angeles. His influence traveled for him. To the public, the 1990s were the age of stars: Tom Cruise, Julia Roberts, Will Smith, Arnold Schwarzenegger. To the press, it was the era of moguls: Sumner Redstone, Rupert Murdoch, Barry Diller. But to insiders, there was another constant: the knowledge that behind the scenes, Sidney Korshak still set the rules of engagement. He wasn't the star, the mogul, or the agent. He was the fixer, and in Hollywood, that meant more than all the titles combined. As the decade closed, Korshak's health finally failed. In 1996, he died quietly in Beverly Hills at the age of 88. There was no great scandal, no courtroom drama, no downfall. He had spent a lifetime walking the tightrope between law and crime, power and invisibility, and he had never once fallen. For Hollywood, his passing was both an end and a beginning. The man was gone, but the system he had embodied, a system where hidden brokers controlled the flow of money, labor, and influence, lived on. Korshak's Hollywood was not about movies. It was about control. And even in death, his legacy ensured that the Dream Factory would always belong, in some measure, to men like him. The 1980s marked a seismic shift in American politics. Ronald Reagan swept into office promising smaller government, lower taxes, and a return to patriotic pride. His campaign slogan, "Morning in America," painted a picture of renewal after the cynicism of the 1970s. But beneath the soaring speeches, the real story was about money. Reagan's America was a place where deregulation was celebrated, where unions were weakened, where capital was unleashed with fewer restraints than ever before. For the supermob, it was a golden age. Reagan's first major confrontation came with organized labor itself. In 1981, when the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization went on strike, Reagan crushed them. He fired more than 11,000 workers, sending a clear signal: the federal government would not tolerate union defiance. For corporate America, it was a green light. For hidden power brokers, it was opportunity. With unions on the defensive, the brokers who had always mediated between labor and management, men like Korshak and his protégés, became even more essential. Corporations wanted labor peace without concessions. They wanted growth without strikes. They wanted global expansion without obstacles. And the supermob knew how to deliver. Deregulation was the other pillar. The Reagan administration loosened rules on banks, airlines, energy, and telecommunications. Entire industries were transformed overnight. For the average American, this meant cheaper flights or more cable channels. For insiders, it meant windfalls, because deregulation created chaos, and chaos always created deals. Assets were spun off, mergers accelerated, and fortunes shifted hands. Brokers who could move capital quietly, who could arrange financing, who could guarantee political cover, suddenly found themselves in even greater demand. The supermob didn't need to appear in Washington. They thrived in the boardrooms and law offices where deregulation spoils were divided. Then came privatization. Government services were outsourced. Public contracts were handed to private corporations. Infrastructure, once managed by the state, was sold off to bidders with connections. And connections were the supermob's specialty. Through decades of political relationships, Through the web of unions, corporations, and shadow financiers, they could ensure their allies won contracts, their companies got licenses, their projects received favorable treatment. In a decade where the mantra was "government is the problem," the real solution was influence, and influence never went out of style. Reagan's presidency was marked by optimism on the surface, but beneath it, inequality widened, speculation soared, and scandals brewed. The savings and loan crisis revealed how deregulated banks could implode under greed. Iran-Contra showed how even foreign policy could be bent to secret networks. And yet, through it all, the deeper structures of hidden power remained untouched. For the Supermob, the Reagan years were not about ideology. They were about leverage. Whether Washington tilted left or right mattered less than whether capital could be moved, labor could be controlled, and deals could be made. And in the 1980s, all three were easier than ever. When Ronald Reagan left office in 1989, the nation stood at a crossroads. The Cold War was drawing to a close, the Soviet Union teetered on collapse, and America was entering a new era of global dominance. George H.W. Bush, Reagan's successor, framed his presidency around a phrase that would define the 1990s: the New World Order. To most Americans, it meant a future of peace and prosperity. But to the power brokers, it meant something else. A world where capital and influence could move more freely than ever before. Bush himself was the consummate insider. A former CIA director, oil executive, and diplomat, he embodied the quiet intersections of business, intelligence, and politics. Under his watch, globalization accelerated. Free trade agreements expanded. Financial markets spread. And with every new opening, the Supermob saw opportunity. Globalization was more than just economics. It was logistics, shipping, construction, labor, and real estate. Each of these industries had long been touchpoints for hidden networks. When American companies expanded abroad, they carried their connections with them. The same lawyers, consultants, and intermediaries who had shaped domestic deals now found themselves brokering contracts in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The game had simply gone international. But it was under Bill Clinton in the 1990s that globalization truly became gospel. Clinton championed NAFTA, opening the borders of trade between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Factories shifted. Jobs migrated. Corporations expanded. For workers, the impact was often devastating. For power brokers, it was lucrative. Every relocation of a plant, every restructuring of a union contract, every cross-border financing deal created new flows of money. And with those flows came the same opportunities for quiet leverage. Unions resisted but weakened. Corporations consolidated but relied on intermediaries. Politicians promised prosperity but quietly depended on donations and favors. It was a cycle that the Supermob had mastered long before the word globalization became a buzzword. The 1990s also marked the rise of the tech economy. Silicon Valley was suddenly the frontier, where startups became billion-dollar companies overnight. The mythology was one of garages and geniuses: Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Larry Ellison. But even in the world of microchips and software, the same old realities applied. Someone had to finance the buildings, handle the labor contracts, secure the permits, manage the real estate. Behind the digital revolution was a physical infrastructure of capital and connections. And those connections often ran through the same networks that had controlled real estate, labor, and finance for decades. The names were new. The patterns were not. Through Bush and Clinton, the United States became the hub of a global economy. Wall Street surged. Hollywood globalized. Las Vegas reinvented itself again. And in the shadows, the networks endured. They had survived Prohibition, survived the mob wars, survived Vegas, survived Watergate, survived Wall Street scandals. The 1990s were no different. The Cold War had ended, but the quiet war for influence never did. By the time Bill Clinton stood for re-election in 1996, America was triumphant on the world stage. The stock market was booming. Silicon Valley was rewriting the future. The middle class was told it was living through prosperity. But for those who knew where to look, the story was the same as it had always been. Power resided not in the headlines, not in the elections, but in the networks that controlled the flow of money and labor behind the curtain. And those networks were alive and well. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 with a whimper, not a bang. One of the most powerful empires in history unraveled in a matter of months, leaving behind political instability, economic collapse, and social upheaval. For ordinary Russians, it was chaos. Empty shelves, unpaid wages, soaring crime. But for a select few, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. These men would become known as the oligarchs. The collapse of state socialism unleashed a fire sale. State-owned factories, oil fields, banks, and media companies were suddenly available for pennies on the dollar. But ordinary Russians had neither the capital nor the connections to seize them. Instead, a small group of insiders, former bureaucrats, black market traders, and politically connected fixers swooped in. They bought state assets for nothing, often using shady loans from the very banks they controlled. Overnight, they became billionaires. The old Soviet elite had vanished, but a new elite was born, richer and more brazen than anything Russia had seen before. The rise of the oligarchs mirrored, almost perfectly, the rise of the supermob decades earlier. Both emerged from chaos. Both thrived in the gray zone between law and crime. Both depended on political connections, financial manipulation, and hidden networks to consolidate power. And just as the supermob had reached across industries, real estate, casinos, unions, finance, so too did the oligarchs. They didn't just control one company. They controlled banks, oil companies, media outlets, even political parties. It was empire building, Russian style. Western capital quickly took notice. The 1990s were the age of globalization, and Wall Street saw Russia as the final frontier. Billions of dollars of investment poured into Moscow, often with little oversight. Banks partnered with oligarchs. Corporations struck joint ventures. Consultants promised stability. But beneath the surface, the same patterns repeated. Deals were greased with bribes. Courts were bought. Violence lingered in the background. Assassinations, kidnappings, bombings. The oligarchs were businessmen in suits, but their power rested on force as much as finance. It was the supermob on steroids, born in the ruins of communism. Some of these figures became household names. Boris Berezovsky, the mathematician turned kingmaker. Roman Abramovich, the oil magnate who would later buy Chelsea Football Club. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once the richest man in Russia before falling afoul of Vladimir Putin. Each embodied the same lesson the supermob had long understood: that in times of upheaval, the greatest fortunes are made not by those who play by the rules, but by those who control the rules. By the mid-1990s, Russian oligarchs were not content with just dominating Moscow. They looked outward, seeking legitimacy, security, and global influence. The easiest way to achieve all three was simple: move money abroad. Billions of dollars flowed out of Russia. Some of it was legal investment. Much of it was not. Shell companies in Cyprus, Swiss bank accounts, offshore havens in the Caribbean. These became the conduits through which fortunes were hidden and laundered. And one of the most attractive destinations for that money was the United States. New York skyscrapers, Miami condos, Beverly Hills mansions, Russian capital flooded into American real estate. To the public, it looked like a luxury boom. To insiders, it was something else. A way to store wealth beyond the reach of Russian politics. The parallels to the supermob were striking. Just as Korshak Circle had used real estate as a vehicle for laundering and leverage, the oligarchs embraced the same strategy on a global scale. A condo tower wasn't just property. It was a bank vault with windows. Wall Street, hungry for capital, welcomed the money. Banks opened accounts. Investment firms created vehicles to absorb foreign wealth. Lawyers and consultants offered compliance services that were little more than fig leaves. It was a marriage of convenience. Oligarchs needed access to Western markets, and Western markets needed new rivers of money. The origins were politely ignored. And once again, it was the intermediaries, the lawyers, the brokers, the fixers who profited most. Just as in the days of the supermob, the real power wasn't in the public face of the deal. It was in the invisible hands that made the deal possible. The oligarchs also discovered American politics. Campaign contributions, charitable donations, speaking events. all became avenues to buy legitimacy. A dinner here, a handshake there, a photograph with a senator or a governor, each was a form of insurance, proof that their money bought not just property but protection. This too was familiar. The supermob had long understood that politics was never about ideology. It was about access, and access was always for sale. By the late 1990s, Russia itself was unraveling again. The ruble collapsed in 1998, wiping out savings and destabilizing banks. But the oligarchs, like the supermob before them, emerged stronger. They had already moved their wealth abroad. They had already bought their insurance in the form of real estate, bank accounts, and political connections. They had survived communism's fall. They would survive capitalism's crash. The story of the Russian oligarchs was, in many ways, a mirror of the American supermob. Both were born in chaos. Both thrived on leverage and connections. Both learned to blend crime with legitimacy until the two were indistinguishable. The difference was scale. Where the supermob had dominated cities, unions, and industries, the oligarchs dominated nations. Their rise was a reminder that the methods of hidden power were universal. The names changed. The accents changed. The system did not. By the dawn of the new millennium, as Vladimir Putin rose to power in Russia and America basked in the glow of its tech boom, the oligarchs and the supermob were part of the same global fabric. A world where money flowed faster than law, and where the men who controlled those flows held more power than any president or prime minister. September 11, 2001, changed everything. In a single morning, America's sense of security was shattered, and its political priorities shifted overnight. The towers had barely fallen before Washington declared war, not just on Al-Qaeda, but on terror itself. The war on terror was not just a military campaign. It was an economic revolution. Trillions of dollars were unleashed on defense, intelligence, security, and reconstruction. New bureaucracies sprang up overnight: the Department of Homeland Security, the Transportation Security Administration. New industries were born: private security contractors, surveillance firms, counterterrorism consultants. For ordinary Americans, it was about fear and safety. For hidden networks, it was about opportunity. The playbook was familiar. Every great crisis in America's history had created fortunes. Prohibition had made gangsters rich. World War II had built the military-industrial complex. The Cold War had fueled aerospace, oil, and intelligence. Now, the war on terror promised its own cycle of contracts and connections. Defense companies flourished. Halliburton, KBR, Bechtel, names that became synonymous with billion-dollar reconstruction deals in Iraq and Afghanistan. But behind the headlines of contracts awarded and bases built were the quiet intermediaries who made the deals possible. Lobbyists steered the money. Lawyers handled the paperwork. Consultants brokered introductions. Just as in the age of casinos and real estate, the true profits often flowed not to the public companies, but to the men and women who arranged the pieces behind the scenes. The privatization of war itself opened doors. Private military contractors like Blackwater operated in a gray zone between soldier and mercenary. They had contracts, but they also had plausible deniability. They were both official and unofficial, legitimate and shadowy. It was the perfect environment for hidden power, because once again the lines blurred. What was government? What was business? What was crime? In Iraq, cash shipments vanished into thin air. In Afghanistan, contracts were inflated, subcontracted, and skimmed. Billions went unaccounted for. And in every shadowy deal, the fingerprints of hidden networks appeared, not as overt mobsters, but as consultants, facilitators, middlemen. Even at home, the new security state was a marketplace. Airports, stadiums, office buildings all needed surveillance systems, biometric scanners, armored vehicles. Entire industries were created overnight, and those with early access to contracts became billionaires. For the supermob, or rather the inheritors of its methods, it was a familiar cycle. They didn't need to own the companies. They only needed to own the connections. The war on terror also reshaped global finance. To track terrorist money, new laws were passed, new compliance systems built. But these same tools also created opportunities. If you could move money without detection, your services became invaluable. Offshore networks expanded, shell companies multiplied, and the world of shadow banking grew more sophisticated. In the name of stopping terror, a new shadow economy had been born. When U.S. forces rolled into Baghdad in 2003, the war was far from over. Saddam Hussein's regime had collapsed, but in its place came a vacuum. And where there is a vacuum, someone always steps in. Billions of US dollars poured into Iraq for reconstruction. Pallets of cash, literal bricks of $100 bills, were flown into the war zone to fund projects. Roads, hospitals, schools, pipelines, all were promised. But the reality was something else. Much of the money vanished. Projects were half-built, then abandoned. Contractors were paid but never delivered. Supplies were overbilled. Subcontracts were layered on subcontracts until accountability evaporated. It was corruption on a scale that shocked even seasoned investigators. But to the insiders, it was business as usual. Afghanistan followed the same pattern. Billions flowed into a country racked by war and tribal conflict. Contractors rushed to build bases, airstrips, supply chains. But again, the money often disappeared. Ghost employees filled payrolls. Equipment was lost in transit. Entire programs existed only on paper. Behind each collapse was a familiar set of players. Middlemen, consultants, power brokers who knew how to navigate the system. They weren't always criminals in the traditional sense. But they operated in the gray zones, where oversight was weak, rules were pliable, and influence was everything. It was the Supermob's model transplanted into the 21st century battlefield. The war on terror also changed Las Vegas, the old playground of hidden power. With tourism hit after September 11th, the casino industry reinvented itself again, this time as a global entertainment empire. Resorts expanded to Macau, Singapore, and beyond. The flow of money from Asia to America and back again created new pipelines of capital. Once more, the intersections of gambling, real estate, and global finance overlapped. And once more, the brokers who could quietly connect those dots profited most. What made the 2000s unique was scale. Prohibition had been national. Las Vegas had been regional. Wall Street was powerful but limited. The war on terror was global, touched every country, every economy, every government. And in that environment, hidden networks thrived. They didn't just skim from casinos or fix labor contracts. They built fortunes on oil contracts in Iraq, on logistics in Afghanistan, on surveillance contracts in Washington, on real estate in Dubai. The world itself had become their playground. By the end of George W. Bush's presidency, America was exhausted. 2 wars, trillions in debt, a housing bubble about to burst. The public saw failure, frustration, endless conflict. But behind the curtain, fortunes had been made, networks had deepened, and the hidden power structure had once again adapted to the times. Because if history had shown anything, it was this. Crises come and go, wars begin and end, but the networks endure. The financial crash of 2008 was not just an economic event. It was a revelation. For millions of Americans, it exposed how fragile the system really was, and how much of it had been built on illusions. It began with housing. For years, banks had been issuing mortgages to anyone who wanted one, regardless of income, savings, or ability to pay. These subprime loans were then bundled into securities and sold to investors around the world. On paper, they looked safe. In reality, they were ticking time bombs. When the housing bubble burst, the bombs went off. Families lost homes. Investors lost billions. Banks teetered on collapse. And the shockwaves spread across the globe. For ordinary Americans, the crash was devastating. But for hidden networks, it was another opportunity. Because chaos creates leverage. And leverage is where power thrives. Even as millions lost homes, vulture funds swooped in to buy foreclosed properties for pennies on the dollar. Hedge funds shorted the market, betting against the very securities that had been sold as safe investments. Lawyers and consultants who had once packaged the deals now offered services to untangle them, for a price. It was once again the familiar cycle. The public loses, the intermediaries win. The bailout was the final insult. Trillions of dollars in government support flowed not to families, but to banks and corporations. The very institutions that had caused the collapse were rescued, while ordinary people were left to pick up the pieces. But for the networks, the bailout was not just survival. It was profit. Those who had the right connections, who could lobby for their slice of the relief money, who knew how to navigate Washington, emerged richer than before. It was the Supermob's model modernized. When collapse comes, make sure you are close enough to the levers of power that the rescue lifts you to. The crash also revealed the shadow banking system, a vast web of hedge funds, offshore accounts, and derivative contracts that operated beyond the reach of regulation. It was a parallel financial world, where trillions of dollars moved with little oversight. For those with access, it was paradise. For those without, it was invisible. And just like the old networks of Chicago lawyers, Las Vegas casinos, and Hollywood fixers, this shadow banking world depended on intermediaries. The power wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet deals in boardrooms, in offshore islands, in phone calls never recorded. The lesson was clear. The crash had not destroyed the system. It had revealed it. The networks of hidden power were not relics of the past. They were the architecture of the present. When the dust of 2008 settled, the United States looked like a wounded giant. Millions of homes had been foreclosed. Entire neighborhoods sat vacant, windows boarded, lawns overgrown. Families who had once believed in the dream of ownership found themselves renters again, or homeless. But in the ruins, a new class of investors moved quickly. Hedge funds, private equity firms, and foreign buyers began scooping up foreclosed homes in bulk. Whole neighborhoods were purchased, renovated, and converted into rental empires. For ordinary people, it was loss. For hidden networks, it was harvest. Wall Street, too, was reborn almost instantly. Propped up by bailouts, banks not only survived but posted record profits within years. Bonuses returned. Stock prices soared. The same institutions that had engineered the collapse emerged stronger, thanks to government support. The public bore the pain. The insiders pocketed the recovery. It was an echo of earlier cycles: prohibition, Vegas, deregulation, each time crisis leading to consolidation, consolidation leading to profit. Real estate became the new frontier for global capital. Russian oligarchs, Chinese tycoons, Middle Eastern sovereign funds all poured money into American property, seeing it as the safest vault for their fortunes. Luxury towers in Manhattan, mansions in Los Angeles, beachfront estates in Miami. These became not just homes, but storage facilities for wealth. The pattern was almost identical to the Supermob's old methods. Invest in property, move the money, hide the source, gain legitimacy. The difference was scale. What once had been done in Chicago high-rises or Beverly Hills estates was now globalized, industrialized, and turbocharged. At the same time, the political system adapted. Campaigns became more dependent than ever on big donors. Lobbyists grew more powerful, shaping the very regulations meant to prevent another crash. The revolving door between Washington and Wall Street spun faster than ever. It wasn't corruption in the old-fashioned sense of envelopes and bribes. It was systemic, a quiet understanding that those with capital and access would always write the rules. And the networks, once again, flourished. By the mid-2010s, America was told it had recovered. Unemployment fell. The stock market hit record highs. But for millions of ordinary people, wages stagnated, costs soared, and the dream of ownership slipped further away. For those watching carefully, the lesson was bitterly familiar. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, for those who understood how to use it. The heirs of the Supermob didn't just survive the greatest financial collapse since the Depression. They turned it into the foundation of a new era of wealth and influence. The 2010s began with recovery, but beneath the surface, the world was restless. The financial crash had shattered trust in institutions, and while Wall Street rebounded, ordinary people felt abandoned. Out of that anger came a wave of populism, left, right, and everything in between. But even as politics fractured, another force was rising quietly, reshaping life more profoundly than any election. Technology. Silicon Valley, once the land of startups and dreamers, had become an empire. Companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple weren't just businesses. They were ecosystems, controlling the way people searched, shopped, communicated, and consumed. Their power dwarfed anything seen before. Casino mogul might control a city. A Wall Street banker might influence markets. But a tech giant could shape the behavior of billions with a tweak to an algorithm with the flip of a switch. This was hidden power of a different kind. Not in smoky backrooms, but in glowing screens. Not in whispered deals, but in lines of code. The methods, however, were eerily familiar. Just like the supermob, the tech giants operated in the gray zones. They spoke the language of innovation while bending rules, avoiding taxes, lobbying governments. They acquired rivals before they became threats. They shaped regulations in their favor. They blurred the line between public good and private empire. And just as the supermob had thrived by embedding itself into unions, Hollywood, and real estate, Silicon Valley embedded itself into daily life. The difference was scale. Instead of a city or a state, they held sway over the globe. Meanwhile, populism surged. In Europe, nationalist movements gained ground. In Britain, Brexit reshaped the continent. In the US, anger over inequality and immigration propelled Donald Trump to the presidency. The narratives were chaotic, but the hidden mechanics were steady. Political campaigns were no longer just about speeches and rallies. They were about data, who had it, how it was used, how it was weaponized. And here again, the tech giants played a central role. Social media became the new battlefield, algorithms the new weapons, targeted ads the new ammunition. It was politics run through the same machinery that sold shoes and phones, but with consequences that shook democracies. The heirs of the supermob recognized the shift. Influence was no longer just about controlling labor unions or casinos. It was about information. Who had it, who controlled it, and who could manipulate it. And just as in every era before, intermediaries appeared, consultants, data firms, lobbyists who bridged the gap between money, politics, and technology. Some operated in plain sight. Others worked in shadows. All understood the same principle. Power comes from being the one who connects the dots. By the middle of the decade, it was clear that technology was no longer just an industry, it was infrastructure. Amazon didn't just sell books. It ran global logistics networks. Google didn't just manage search. It organized the world's knowledge. Facebook didn't just connect friends. It became the marketplace of ideas, propaganda, and manipulation. And Apple didn't just make devices. It built a closed ecosystem where billions of people lived their digital lives. Each company became a monopoly in all but name. Their leaders, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, Sundar Pichai, were treated as visionaries. But behind the public image, their companies used tactics that were as ruthless as any old-world power broker. Rivals were acquired or crushed. Workers were pushed to the margins. Governments were lobbied into compliance. It was the supermob's logic, repackaged in a Silicon Valley hoodie. Politics, meanwhile, was reshaped by populism. Leaders from Hungary to Brazil to the Philippines rose by railing against elites, even as they often forged quiet ties with wealthy backers and hidden networks. In the US, Donald Trump's election in 2016 stunned the establishment. His rise was fueled not only by traditional rallies and speeches, but by the dark magic of social media, targeted misinformation, viral memes, algorithmic amplification. The mechanics of influence had changed, but the underlying principle was ancient. Control the narrative and you control the people. And the intermediaries who could manipulate data, channel anger, and direct attention suddenly became some of the most powerful players in the world. Globally, hidden power became a contest between nations as much as within them. Russia weaponized cyber operations and disinformation, blending digital warfare with old-school tactics of infiltration and compromise. China expanded its Belt and Road Initiative, building infrastructure across the world while embedding itself in global supply chains. These weren't just geopolitical moves. They were economic ecosystems, the kind of quiet leverage the supermob had once practiced on city councils, now scaled up to entire continents. For ordinary people, the decade was a paradox. Technology promised connection, yet deepened division. Politics promised empowerment, yet delivered polarization. The economy promised recovery, yet entrenched inequality. But for hidden networks, the 2010s were fertile ground. Every disruption created a new opening. Every populist wave brought new intermediaries eager to sell access. Every innovation built new dependencies that someone could quietly control. The names were different. The tools were digital. But the architecture of influence, the quiet brokers, the shadow deals, the hidden leverage was exactly the same. As the decade closed, the stage was set for the next upheaval. A world saturated with technology, polarized by politics, and strained by inequality was about to face a shock unlike anything in a century. The networks were ready. The public was not. The year 2020 began with a whisper and ended with a roar. What started as scattered reports of a virus in Wuhan, China, soon became a global catastrophe. Borders closed. Economies froze. Streets emptied. And in the silence, fear spread faster than the virus itself. For ordinary people, the pandemic was confusion, loss, and hardship. Jobs vanished. Families grieved. A way of life dissolved almost overnight. But for hidden networks, the pandemic was, as every crisis before it, an opening. The first wave of profit came with panic. Supply chains collapsed. Masks, ventilators, gloves, sanitizers, all became commodities. Prices soared. Contracts were rushed. In the scramble, billions flowed into the hands of those who could secure deals, cut corners, or move product when others could not. It was a familiar pattern. Chaos at the bottom, opportunity at the top. Then came the vaccines. Pharmaceutical companies became the new titans, commanding both political leverage and financial windfalls. But behind them stood an ecosystem of lobbyists, consultants, and intermediaries who ensured contracts, approvals, and distribution favored certain players. The narrative was health and safety. The reality was also access and profit. Meanwhile, the digital transformation accelerated. With people locked indoors, the world moved online overnight. Work, school, shopping, entertainment, all shifted to the virtual realm. Tech giants, already dominant, became essential. Amazon's warehouses ran day and night. Zoom became a household word. Social media became the new town square, filled with both connection and misinformation. And just as always, hidden power thrived in the transition. Those who controlled platforms controlled discourse. Those who controlled data controlled behavior. Those who controlled logistics controlled survival. The pandemic revealed something profound, that the infrastructure of modern life was not governments, but networks. Governments struggled.
Institutions faltered.
But platforms, corporations, and shadowed intermediaries kept the system moving for a price. It was the supermob's lesson writ large. True power does not always wear a title. It does not always sit in the open. It resides in the hands of those who can move, adapt, and profit when everything else collapses. As the pandemic dragged on, it became clear that COVID-19 was more than a health crisis. It was a stress test for every system in the world, political, economic, social. Some systems broke, others bent, but the networks endured. Geopolitically, the balance shifted. China, having endured the first wave, leveraged its manufacturing might to flood the world with masks, tests, and later vaccines. Supply chains that once seemed invisible were suddenly matters of national security. A single factory in Shenzhen or Wuhan could decide whether shelves in Europe or America were stocked or bare. Russia, meanwhile, exploited chaos through disinformation campaigns, seeding doubt about vaccines, elections, and institutions. It was influenced through division, a modern extension of tactics honed in the Soviet era, amplified by digital tools. And Western democracies, struggling with polarization, found themselves weakened. Trust in institutions eroded. Conspiracy theories flourished. Leaders stumbled. In that environment, hidden networks didn't just survive. They multiplied. The digital realm became the new foundation of power. Data wasn't just valuable, it was vital. Governments tracked citizens to contain the virus. Corporations tracked behavior to sell products. Algorithms shaped attention, belief, and fear. The public lived in uncertainty. The intermediaries who could interpret, manipulate, or control the flow of information lived in opportunity. Economically, fortunes shifted at lightning speed. Billionaires added trillions in collective wealth while small businesses closed by the millions. Stock markets soared even as unemployment spiked. The gap between the visible economy and the lived reality widened until it became a chasm. But once again, this was not a bug in the system. It was the system. The networks had always known. Crisis consolidates. And in consolidation, power grows. The pandemic, then, was not a break in history. It was a continuation of the same cycle we have traced since the days of Sidney Korshak. Crisis creates chaos. Chaos creates opportunity. Opportunity flows to those who can navigate the gray zones, who can sit in the shadows, who can move unseen while the world looks elsewhere. That was true in Prohibition-era Chicago. It was true in post-war Hollywood. It was true in Cold War Las Vegas. And it is just as true in the digital, globalized, pandemic-stricken 21st century. The legacy of the Supermob is not about one man or even one network. It is about the architecture of hidden power itself. Adaptable, resilient, shape-shifting. It does not vanish when exposed. It simply evolves. Today it wears the face of the consultant, the lobbyist, the hedge fund manager, the data broker, the tech mogul. Tomorrow it may wear another. But the core lesson endures. Real power is rarely visible. It is built in relationships, in leverage, in the ability to turn crisis into fortune. And while the names and industries may change, the game remains the same. As the world looks toward the future, with climate change, AI, geopolitical rivalry, and new pandemics on the horizon, one truth stands clear. The hidden networks will be there, watching, waiting, profiting. The only question is whether the rest of us can learn to see them.